They didn't know it yet. Not the colonial officers, not the teachers in stiff classrooms, not the empire that believed it owned the land, people, and the future. They didn't know that in the early 1900s, a boy was being born who would one day challenge British authority without lifting a weapon. A boy whose voice would grow loud enough to travel across borders. A boy whose ideas would wake up a nation that had been taught to sleep. Before the speeches, before the crowds, before the name that history would never forget, there was just a child. A child named Benjamin Nnamdi Azikiwe. He was born on November 16, 1904, in Zunguru, a quiet town shaped by colonial rule. At the time, Nigeria wasn't a country. It was a project, a possession, a place controlled by outsiders who believed they knew better than the people who lived there. Nnamdi was born into a world where black ambition was expected to stay small, where African intelligence was questioned, where obedience was rewarded more than excellence. But even at birth, his story was already different. His father, Obededom Chukwemeke Azikiwe, worked as a clerk in the British colonial administration. That meant he saw power up close. He watched how the system worked, who benefited and who didn't. He understood that the British didn't rule because they were better, but because they controlled education, language, and opportunity. His mother, Rachel Chinwe Azikiwe, gave Nnamdi something equally powerful. She gave him identity. She filled his childhood with stories, values, and pride. She reminded him where he came from in a world that constantly tried to make Africans forget themselves. So from the beginning, Nnamdi lived between two worlds. African culture at home, colonial control outside. Most people grow confused living like that. Nnamdi grew curious. As a child, he moved constantly. Zunguru, Onitsha, Calabar, Lagos. Every new place brought new people, new customs, and new ways of thinking. While other children struggled to fit in, Nnamdi observed everything. He listened more than he spoke. He learned how people thought. And he learned languages. Not just his mother tongue, he learned Hausa, Yoruba, English. He didn't just speak them, he understood them. By the time he was young, he could communicate across cultures in a way most adults couldn't. Without realizing it, he was already practicing unity in a divided land. School revealed something else about him. He was brilliant. Teachers noticed immediately. He read faster, thought deeper, asked questions others were too scared to ask. And that was the problem, because colonial education wasn't designed to encourage African students to think freely. It was designed to train them to obey. So when lessons suggested Africans were inferior, Nnamdi pushed back. When teachers repeated ideas that placed Europeans above everyone else, he challenged them. Not loudly, not rudely, but confidently. And confidence from an African student was seen as rebellion. He was punished, suspended, at times pushed out of schools altogether. But instead of breaking him, every punishment strengthened something inside him. He began to understand that systems don't punish you for being wrong, they punish you for being dangerous. Then life hit harder. Money ran out. School fees became impossible to pay. Food became uncertain. Education, the one thing he believed could unlock freedom, started slipping out of reach. There were moments when the dream nearly died, moments when hunger distracted him more than homework, moments when sleeping on hard floors felt more familiar than comfort, moments when giving up felt logical. But Nnamdi refused to accept logic that kept him small. He worked whatever jobs he could find. He borrowed books. He studied late into the night by weak light. He skipped meals but never skipped learning. Somewhere in that struggle, a belief formed that would shape his entire life. Education wasn't just about certificates, it was about power. And power was the only language empires respected. Then came the decision that changed everything. America. In the 1920s, this wasn't a casual plan. Traveling from colonial Africa to the United States required courage, money, and belief that most people didn't have. People laughed at the idea. Some discouraged him. Others told him it was impossible. Nnamdi didn't argue. In 1925, with almost nothing in his pocket but everything in his heart, he boarded a ship and left Africa behind. America welcomed him with reality. Racism wasn't hidden, segregation was legal, opportunities were limited. Life was hard. He worked brutal jobs, dishwashing, farming, cleaning, jobs that drained his body before his studies even began. Some nights, he studied after working for hours. Some nights, he slept in libraries because he had nowhere else to go. But something unexpected happened. America didn't crush him. It sharpened him. He entered Lincoln University and later studied at Howard University and the University of Pennsylvania. He absorbed political science, journalism, psychology, and philosophy like someone preparing for war, not with weapons, but with ideas. He began writing, and his writing had teeth. He saw clearly now. Africa's problem wasn't lack of intelligence, it was lack of control over its own narrative. As long as Africans were spoken for, spoken about, and spoken over, freedom would remain distant. That realization changed his purpose. He wasn't studying just to succeed personally. He was preparing to return home and challenge a system that depended on African silence. By the time Nnamdi Azikiwe was ready to leave America, he was no longer just a student chasing dreams. He was educated, focused, politically awake, and ready. Because the next chapter of his life wouldn't be about surviving. It would be about fighting back with newspapers, with ideas, and with a voice that colonial rulers were not prepared for. And that was only the beginning.
When Nnamdi Azikiwe returned to Africa, he didn't come back quietly. He didn't come back asking for approval. He didn't come back trying to fit into a system that had already decided his limits. He came back with something far more dangerous than protest. He came back with ideas. Africa in the 1930s was restless. Colonial rule was still strong, but cracks were forming. Educated Africans were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Workers were frustrated. Students were angry. Traditional rulers were being used as middlemen for foreign control. The people felt it. Something was wrong. But what they didn't yet have was a voice powerful enough to connect all that frustration into a movement. That voice was Nnamdi Azikiwe. Fresh from America, his mind was sharp, his confidence unshakable, and his pen deadly. He understood something the colonial government desperately underestimated. You don't need guns to start a revolution. You need a story. And Nnamdi Azikiwe knew exactly how to tell one. He began his career in journalism in the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. Writing for newspapers, he didn't just report events, he interpreted them. He questioned colonial policies, he highlighted African achievement, he challenged the idea that Europeans were natural rulers and Africans were natural followers. Colonial officials noticed immediately. This wasn't normal journalism, this was subversion with grammar. His writing was confident, educated, and impossible to dismiss as ignorance. He spoke the colonizers' language better than they expected, and he used it against them. Soon, he returned to Nigeria, and that's when everything changed. In 1937, Nnamdi Azikiwe founded a newspaper that would rewrite Nigerian history, the West African Pilot. The name alone was bold. It suggested direction, leadership, movement. From the very first issue, it was clear. This was not a neutral paper. This was a weapon. The West African Pilot didn't beg for equality. It demanded it. It spoke directly to everyday Nigerians, market women, dock workers, students, clerks, people the colonial government rarely listened to. It explained politics in simple language. It exposed injustice openly. It criticized colonial officials by name, and it did something revolutionary. It made Nigerians believe in themselves. Azikiwe's editorials were sharp and unapologetic. He wrote about African pride, about black dignity, about the lie of European superiority. He reminded readers that civilization did not start in Europe and intelligence was not imported. For the first time, many Nigerians saw their thoughts printed on paper, and they loved it. Circulation exploded. The paper spread beyond cities, beyond expectations. Copies were passed hand to hand, read aloud in public spaces, discussed passionately. The colonial government panicked, because now Nigerians weren't just complaining, they were thinking together. Azikiwe didn't stop at one paper. He built a media empire. The Eastern Nigerian Guardian, the Nigerian Spokesman, the Southern Nigerian Defender. Each one targeted a region. Each one carried the same message. Africa is not inferior. Colonialism is not destiny. Freedom is possible. And for the first time, colonial rule was being challenged daily, not by riots, but by headlines. British officials tried everything. They warned him, they threatened him, they dragged him to court. Azikiwe was sued multiple times for sedition. Sedition. That was the charge for telling Africans they deserve dignity. But here's the problem for the colonial government. Azikiwe was too smart. He knew the law, he knew language, he knew how to criticize without crossing technical lines. And every court case made him more famous. To young Nigerians, he wasn't just a journalist anymore. He was a hero. They called him Zik. Short, sharp, powerful. Zik of Africa. University students worshipped him. Workers quoted him. Political discussions now revolved around his articles. And then came the fear. Because when people start thinking, they eventually start organizing. Azikiwe understood that words alone weren't enough. Words had to turn to action. So he stepped into politics. In the early 1940s, nationalism was growing across Africa. Indians were challenging British rule. Other colonies were waking up. Nigeria was ready. Zik helped transform political consciousness into political structure. He became a central figure in the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, the NCNC. This wasn't just a political party, it was a movement. The NCNC demanded self-government, equal rights, an end to racial discrimination, Nigerian participation in decision-making. Zik traveled constantly, town to town, village to village, region to region. He spoke to crowds that had never seen a leader like him before, educated, confident, unapologetically African. His speeches weren't boring. They were emotional, inspirational, easy to understand. He didn't talk down to people. He spoke with them. And everywhere he went, the crowds grew larger. Colonial officials were nervous now because this was no longer just journalism. This was mass mobilization. They tried to paint him as dangerous, as radical, as divisive. But the truth was simple. Zik was saying out loud what millions were thinking. That made him unstoppable. By the mid-1940s, he was one of the most influential Africans alive. But power always attracts enemies. Not just from the British, from within Nigeria too. Ethnic politics began to rise. Regional competition, personal ambition. Leaders who wanted independence, but only if they were in control. Zik believed deeply in unity. One Nigeria, one people, one future. But unity is hard when fear and ego enter the room. Still, he pushed forward. He believed independence was close, and he was right. But what he didn't yet know was that fighting the British would be easier than fighting Nigerians themselves. Because the next phase of his life wouldn't just test his intelligence, it would test his patience, his values, and his belief in unity. And that's where the real struggle begins.
By the late 1940s, one thing was clear. Nigeria was no longer asleep. The newspapers had done their job. The speeches had done their job. The people had tasted political awareness, and there was no going back. Colonial rule was still standing, but it was wobbling. Every protest, every debate, every election pushed it closer to collapse. And right at the center of it all was Nnamdi Azikiwe. Zik had become more than a leader. He was a symbol. To millions of Nigerians, he represented what was possible when education met courage, when African identity met confidence, when fear was replaced by belief. But symbols attract pressure. And now, the pressure was coming from every direction. As independence grew closer, Nigerian politics became tense. Not hopeful tension, dangerous tension. The kind where unity sounds good in speeches, but power decides behavior. Colonialism had divided Nigeria into regions, and now, as the British prepared to leave, those divisions began to harden. The North, the West, the East. Different cultures, different interests, different fears. Zik believed deeply that Nigeria had to rise as one. He spoke constantly about unity, cooperation, and shared destiny. To him, independence meant nothing if Nigeria broke apart the moment the British left. But not everyone agreed. Some leaders wanted independence, yes, but only if their region controlled the future. Ethnic loyalty began to matter more than national vision. Politics became a chess game, and trust became rare. Still, Azikiwe stayed in the fight. He contested elections, he negotiated with colonial authorities, he sat in conferences where Nigeria's future was debated sentence by sentence. And sometimes, those rooms were colder than any prison. Because this was no longer a fight against outsiders, it was a struggle among brothers. In 1954, Nigeria became a federation, and Azikiwe became the premier of the Eastern region. For many, it felt like a win. One of their own was finally in charge of something real. And Azikiwe took the role seriously. He focused on education, on development, on building institutions that would last beyond him. Universities expanded, schools grew, young people were encouraged to dream bigger than survival. But even in power, Zik didn't feel complete. Because his vision was bigger than one region. He wanted a united Nigeria standing tall on the world stage. As independence approached, political alliances shifted constantly. Parties merged, parties split, promises were made and broken. Azikiwe made sacrifices for unity, sometimes controversial ones, decisions that confused supporters, compromises that critics called weakness. But in his mind, he was playing the long game. Then came 1960. The year everything changed. Nigeria was finally free. After decades of struggle, debate, resistance, and sacrifice, the British lowered their flag. Nigerians raised theirs. October 1st, 1960, Independence Day. The streets were alive, music everywhere, hope everywhere, pride everywhere. And Nnamdi Azikiwe stood at the heart of history. He became Nigeria's first Governor-General, the ceremonial head of state, the face of the nation to the world, the man who welcomed diplomats, represented Nigeria abroad, and symbolized African self-rule. But history rarely works like that. Behind the celebrations, the cracks were still there. Regional distrust, political rivalry, power struggles hiding behind smiles. The British had left, but they hadn't taught Nigeria how to stay united. In 1963, Nigeria became a republic, and Azikiwe was sworn in as the first president of Nigeria. The title was historic, the moment was massive, but the power limited. Real authority rested elsewhere, with regional premiers and political heavyweights who often cared more about dominance than cooperation. Zik found himself in a strange position. He was the face of the nation, but not always the hand on the wheel. Still, he tried. He warned against corruption, spoke against ethnic hatred, encouraged dialogue over confrontation. But his words were increasingly ignored. Politics grew uglier. Elections were disputed, accusations flew, violence crept in, trust disappeared. And then came the moment no one saw coming. January 1966, the military struck. A coup. Leaders were killed, government collapsed overnight, Nigeria woke up in shock. Azikiwe was abroad when it happened. By the time he returned, the Nigeria he helped create was unrecognizable. Military rule replaced democracy, fear replaced optimism, and just like that, the dream began to slip. For Zik, it was devastating. He had fought for independence, unity, and civilian rule. Now soldiers held power, and the political system he believed in was gone. But even then, he didn't disappear. He spoke cautiously. He advised when allowed. He tried to calm tensions as Nigeria slid closer to disaster. Because the worst was still ahead. Ethnic violence exploded. Trust collapsed completely, and the nation he loved began tearing itself apart. Civil war was coming, and Azikiwe would soon face the most painful chapter of his life. A chapter where every choice would cost him something, and where history would judge him harder than ever. By the time the 1960s reached their end, Nigeria was no longer the hopeful nation people celebrated at independence. It was tense, broken, afraid. The political system had collapsed, trust between regions had evaporated, and the military, once seen as a temporary solution, had settled into power. For Nnamdi Azikiwe, this was the nightmare he had warned about. Years earlier, he had begged Nigerian leaders to put unity above ambition, to think beyond tribe and territory, to build institutions strong enough to survive disagreement. But now, those warnings felt like echoes no one had listened to. After the coup of 1966, ethnic violence spread rapidly. Thousands were killed in communal attacks, especially in the north. Fear traveled faster than facts. Families fled, communities turned inward, and the eastern region felt cornered. The pain was real, the anger was real, the fear was real. And in that storm stood Nnamdi Azikiwe, elder statesman, former president, symbol of unity, now forced into the most difficult position of his life. The East began moving towards separation. Leaders argued that their people could no longer be safe in Nigeria, that the federation had failed them, that independence from Nigeria was the only option left. Nnamdi Azikiwe had always believed in one Nigeria, but belief is tested when lives are at stake. He tried to mediate, tried to negotiate, tried to slow the rush toward disaster, but the ground was already shaking. In 1967, the eastern region declared itself the independent state of Biafra. Civil war began. Nigeria split into two sides, and suddenly there were no easy answers, only consequences. Nnamdi Azikiwe's position shocked many. He supported Biafra. For his critics, this was betrayal. The man who preached unity was now backing separation. The father of Nigerian nationalism appeared to be standing against the nation he helped create. But for Nnamdi Azikiwe, it wasn't that simple. He believed the crisis had moved beyond politics into survival, that the safety and dignity of his people mattered in a moment when the system had failed to protect them. Still, the weight of that decision never left him. The war was brutal. Resources disappeared. Families suffered. Hope thinned. Nnamdi Azikiwe was used as a diplomat, traveling abroad to explain Biafra's position and seek support. He spoke carefully, knowing the world was watching. But international backing never fully came. And slowly, reality set in. Biafra could not win. As the war dragged on, Nnamdi Azikiwe began to reconsider. The cost was too high, the suffering too deep, the future too uncertain. He shifted his stance and called for peace and reintegration. He urged dialogue instead of continued bloodshed. Some felt betrayed again. First Nigeria, then Biafra, now peace. But Nnamdi Azikiwe was thinking beyond pride. He was thinking about the generations that would come after. In 1970, the war ended. Biafra was defeated. Nigeria was whole again, but scarred beyond measure. Nnamdi Azikiwe returned to public life quietly. No victory parades, no loud speeches, No celebration, just reflection. He was no longer the central political force he once was. Younger leaders dominated the scene. Military governments came and went, but Zik didn't disappear. He became a moral voice, a reminder. He spoke about reconciliation, about forgiveness, about learning from mistakes rather than rewriting them. He urged Nigerians not to weaponize history, but to understand it. He accepted honors, received titles, was celebrated across Africa as a pioneer of independence. Yet behind the recognition was a man carrying heavy regret. He had seen the dream of unity crack. He had watched power destroy trust. He had lived long enough to see hope replaced by caution. Still, he refused to be bitter. Instead, he turned toward legacy. Education remained his passion. He supported universities, encouraged young people to read, think, and question authority. He reminded them that independence without responsibility was empty. As years passed, Nnamdi Azikiwe aged gracefully. His voice softened, but his presence remained powerful. When he spoke, people listened, not because he held office, but because he had lived history. And maybe that was his greatest role in the end. Not as president, not as nationalist, not as revolutionary, but as a witness. A man who had seen empire fall, nations rise, and ideals tested by reality. And as Nigeria moved forward, messy, complicated, unfinished, one truth remained impossible to deny. Without Nnamdi Azikiwe, there would be no Nigeria as it is known today. But his story wasn't over yet, because legacies aren't defined only by power. They are defined by what remains after the noise fades. And that final chapter was still waiting to be written. By the time the guns went silent and Nigeria tried to move on, Nnamdi Azikiwe had already stepped out of the race for power. Not because he was defeated, but because he understood something most leaders never do. History is louder than office. The nation he helped bring into existence was no longer young. It had been through coups, betrayal, war, and loss. The optimism of independence had been replaced with caution. People no longer asked, what can Nigeria become? They asked, can Nigeria survive? And Zik watched it all with quiet eyes. He had nothing left to prove. He had already fought the empire, already awakened the people, already stood at the highest office the nation could offer. Now, his role was different. He became memory. He returned to writing, speaking, and teaching. When he addressed audiences, his tone wasn't fiery anymore. It was reflective, calm, heavy with experience. He spoke about mistakes without naming enemies, about unity without pretending it was easy, about leadership without glorifying power. Young Nigerians saw him differently now, not as a politician, but as a reference point. When debates about nationalism, identity, or democracy came up, his name surfaced naturally. Not because he was perfect, but because he had been there at the beginning. He had carried the dream when it was fragile. Universities honored him, streets carried his name, institutions invited him to speak. But what made his legacy unique was this. He never tried to control how history remembered him. He didn't rewrite events, didn't defend every decision, didn't pretend he got everything right. He allowed his story to stay human. In interviews, he often returned to the same idea, that education was the true foundation of freedom, that colonialism succeeded not just through force, but through controlling how people saw themselves, and that liberation, real liberation, began in the mind. Even in old age, he read constantly. He followed world events. He cared deeply about Africa's place in global affairs. He believed the continent's future depended on thinkers as much as leaders. And when Nigeria struggled, as it often did, he never disowned it. He criticized, yes, but he never gave up. In 1996, Nnamdi Azikiwe passed away at age 91. No drama, no controversy, just the quiet end of a very loud life. But death didn't close his chapter. It opened a conversation. Because once the noise faded, Nigerians began asking harder questions. What does independence really mean?
What does unity require? What kind of leaders does Nigeria need? And every path back to those questions leads to Zik, to the boy who questioned colonial classrooms, to the student who crossed oceans with nothing but belief, to the journalist who turned ink into resistance, to the leader who chose ideas over weapons, to the elder who carried regret without bitterness. Zik of Africa wasn't perfect, but he was necessary. He proved that Africans could think for themselves at a time when the world doubted it. He proved that media could shape freedom. He proved that a nation could be imagined before it existed. And maybe most importantly, he proved that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it writes, sometimes it teaches, sometimes it waits. Today, Nigeria is still unfinished, still arguing with itself, still searching for balance. But the foundation Zik laid remains. Every conversation about unity, every fight for free expression, every belief that Nigeria can be better than it is, that's his echo. So when people ask who Nnamdi Azikiwe was, the answer isn't just Nigeria's first president. He was the man who taught a nation how to think about itself. And that kind of legacy, it doesn't fade. It waits for the next generation to pick it up and continue the story.
They didn't expect her to matter. She was born in 1900 in Abeokuta, at a time when girls were taught one thing and one thing only: stay quiet, stay useful, stay invisible. But history had other plans. Before the protests, before the prisons, before the British officials trembling behind their desks, before the world called her a legend, she was just a girl who asked too many questions. And that was her first act of rebellion. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was born into a world stacked against her. Nigeria was under British colonial rule, and power was hoarded tightly by men, by kings, by colonizers who believed African voices were background noise. Women weren't even in the room. But Funmilayo wasn't wired for silence. From an early age, she noticed things other people ignored. Why were women doing the most work but getting the least say? Why were markets full of women, yet decisions were made by men who never stepped foot there? Why did authority always speak with a foreign accent? These questions didn't make her popular. They made her dangerous. Her parents saw something special in her early on. Instead of shutting her curiosity down, they fueled it. At a time when educating girls was considered unnecessary, sometimes even wasteful, Funmilayo was sent to school. Not just any school. She became one of the first Nigerian girls to receive formal Western education. That alone was revolutionary, but Funmilayo wasn't satisfied with being the first. She didn't want to be a rare exception. She wanted a new normal. Then, something happened that changed her forever. She left Nigeria. Funmilayo traveled to England to continue her education, becoming the first Nigerian woman to attend a British school. Suddenly, she was face to face with the very system ruling her homeland, and what she saw shocked her. The British love to talk about civilization, about order, about justice. But Funmilayo noticed the hypocrisy fast. In England, she watched women organizing, protesting, demanding their rights. She saw female voices shaking institutions. She saw power being challenged and sometimes won. And a realization hit her like lightning. If women could challenge power here, why not at home? That thought followed her back to Nigeria like a quiet storm, growing louder with every step. When Funmilayo returned to Abeokuta, she didn't come back as the same girl. She came back awake. Nigeria hadn't changed, but she had. She became a teacher, one of the most respected professions at the time. But she wasn't just teaching math and reading. She was teaching confidence, critical thinking, self-worth. Her classroom became a training ground for minds that refused to shrink, and that scared people. Because educated women don't just raise children, they raise questions. Funmilayo married Israel Ransome-Kuti, a fellow educator and reformer. Together, they believed education wasn't just about passing exams, it was about liberation. But Funmilayo wasn't content standing beside change. She wanted to lead it. She watched market women struggle under unfair taxes imposed by colonial authorities and enforced by local rulers. These women were being taxed for simply existing, while men in power stayed untouched. It was injustice on loop. And Funmilayo, she had reached her limit. Here's the thing about Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti. She didn't protest quietly. She didn't ask politely. She didn't wait for permission. She organized. She listened to women who had never been listened to before. She turned their anger into strategy, their frustration into unity. What started as conversations became meetings. Meetings became movements. And then history shifted. She helped form what would become the Abeokuta Women's Union, a powerhouse collective of thousands of women, traders, mothers, farmers, women the system had written off as powerless. But together, they were unstoppable. They marched, they sang, they shut down markets, they refused to pay unjust taxes, and for the first time, authority felt real pressure. The local ruler, the Alake of Abeokuta, had never dealt with anything like this. Women weren't supposed to organize, they weren't supposed to confront power, they definitely weren't supposed to win. But Funmilayo wasn't playing by old rules. She confronted the Alake directly, demanding accountability. She spoke boldly, publicly, fearlessly, something almost unheard of for a woman at the time. The message was clear. You can't rule over us and ignore us anymore. Colonial officials were furious. They called her disruptive, they called her aggressive, they called her a problem. But what they really meant was they couldn't control her. Funmilayo became a constant headache for the British administration. Surveillance followed her, threats circled her, pressure mounted, and still she didn't stop. She believed something radical, that women were not accessories to history, they were its engine. That belief turned her into a symbol, not just in Abeokuta, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa. By the late 1940s, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was no longer just a teacher or activist, she was a movement. Her actions led to massive reforms. Taxes on women were challenged, power structures were shaken. Eventually, the Alake was forced to temporarily abdicate. Let that sink in. A woman leading women forced a king backed by colonial power to step aside in a world that said women had no voice. But victory didn't mean peace, because when you challenge power this hard, power hits back, harder. The British government labeled her a threat. Travel restrictions were placed on her. She was harassed, arrested, watched. They couldn't silence her, but they could try to isolate her. And still, she kept speaking. Funmilayo's story wasn't just about protest. It was about vision. She fought for women's voting rights. She pushed for Nigerian independence. She connected local struggles to global movements, meeting leaders and activists around the world. She understood something crucial. Freedom isn't local. It's connected. And while the world saw an activist, at home, she was also a mother. One of her children would grow up to become Fela Anikulapo Kuti, a revolutionary musician whose voice would shake governments through sound. That wasn't a coincidence. Rebellion ran in the family. But don't get it twisted. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti didn't raise rebels by accident. She raised them by example. By refusing to bow, by refusing to disappear, by refusing to be quiet. This was only the beginning, because the more she fought, the more dangerous her life became. And the cost of resistance was higher than anyone expected. Power doesn't panic right away. First, it laughs. Then it ignores. And when that doesn't work, it strikes back. By the early 1950s, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was no longer just a respected activist in Abeokuta. She had crossed an invisible line. She had become uncontainable. And that scared everyone who benefited from the system staying exactly the way it was. The Abeokuta Women's Union had grown into a force no one could pretend not to see. Thousands of women stood behind Funmilayo, not whispering, not begging, but demanding. They demanded fair taxation. They demanded representation. They demanded respect. And for colonial officials watching from their offices, this was a nightmare scenario. Because if women could organize like this, what would stop everyone else? The British administration began tightening the rope. Funmilayo was watched constantly. Her meetings were monitored, her movements recorded, letters were intercepted, allies were questioned. They didn't arrest her outright, not yet. They wanted to wear her down first. But Funmilayo had been tired her whole life, and she kept going anyway. Here's what made her different. She wasn't fighting just for women in Abeokuta. She was fighting for Nigeria. She spoke openly about independence, about self-rule, about Africans controlling African futures. She connected women's liberation to national liberation, something the colonial government absolutely did not want spreading. And the more they tried to box her in, the louder her voice became. Funmilayo began traveling within Nigeria and beyond, building connections with activists across Africa and the world. She attended conferences, she spoke internationally, she refused to let colonial borders limit her influence. This wasn't just local resistance anymore. This was global. And the British noticed. That's when the label came down. Subversive, communist sympathizer, agitator. In colonial language, these words had one meaning: enemy. Without proof, without trial, Funmilayo was branded dangerous, not because of weapons, but because of ideas. And ideas? Those are harder to kill. Then came the travel bans. Funmilayo was suddenly denied visas, blocked from attending international meetings, stopped from leaving the country. The message was clear. Stay in your lane, stay quiet, stay put. But Funmilayo didn't believe in lanes built by oppression. She spoke out publicly against the bans, calling them what they were: an attempt to silence a woman who refused to serve colonial comfort. And for that, she paid a price. She was arrested. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Dragged from protests, detained without dignity, treated like a criminal for demanding justice. Each arrest was meant to humiliate her. Each one failed. Because every time Funmilayo walked free, her reputation grew stronger. People didn't see a troublemaker. They saw courage. Market women whispered her name like a prayer. Young activists studied her strategies. Girls watched her and thought, if she can do this, maybe I can too. That's when power realized something terrifying. They couldn't erase her influence, so they tried something else. They went after her credibility. Colonial newspapers painted her as reckless, dangerous, too radical, unwomanly. They mocked her appearance, criticized her voice, questioned her morality. Classic move. When you can't defeat a woman's ideas, you attack her character. Funmilayo saw right through it, and instead of shrinking, she doubled down. She helped transform the Abeokuta Women's Union into a national movement, pushing women's political participation across Nigeria. She campaigned for voting rights, insisting women deserved a say in the country's future. At the time, that idea was explosive. Women voting, women leading, unthinkable to those afraid of change. But Funmilayo had already imagined a different Nigeria, One where leadership didn't wear just one face. One where freedom wasn't selective. One where women weren't afterthoughts. And she was willing to fight for it. Meanwhile, at home, the cost was rising. Her activism strained her family. Constant surveillance meant her household was never truly private. Threats lingered. Tension followed. Still, she didn't retreat. Because Funmilayo understood something deeply personal. If I stop now, everything I've taught means nothing. Her children watched her closely. One son especially absorbed everything. The courage, the defiance, the refusal to bow. Years later, the world would know him as Fela Anikulapo Kuti. But long before the music, before the fame, he knew what resistance looked like. He grew up watching his mother stare power in the face and refuse to blink. By the mid-1950s, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was officially considered one of the most dangerous women in Nigeria. Not because she carried weapons, but because she carried conviction. And conviction spreads. Internationally, she became a symbol of African women's resistance. She connected with global movements pushing back against imperialism and inequality. And this only made colonial authorities more nervous, because once the world starts watching, abuse gets harder to hide. So, they tightened restrictions even more. Her passport was seized, her movements limited, her voice targeted. They hoped time would quiet her. They were wrong. Funmilayo shifted tactics. If she couldn't travel physically, she traveled through ideas, through speeches, through letters, through mentorship. She trained younger activists, built systems that didn't rely on her presence alone. She made herself replaceable on purpose. That's how real movements survive. But power doesn't like losing control. And eventually, frustration turned into something darker. Because when intimidation fails, oppression escalates. The government increased harassment. Police presence around her home intensified. Meetings were broken up. Supporters were threatened. And still, Funmilayo stood. By now, she knew something crucial. The fight ahead would be brutal, not just politically, but personally. And yet, she didn't slow down because she believed history was watching and she refused to be remembered as someone who stopped when it got hard. But what no one could have predicted was how violent the backlash would eventually become, how deeply personal it would turn, how much she would lose. Because in the next chapter of her life, the state would stop trying to silence her voice and start attacking her body, her family, and her safety. There's a moment in every resistance story where the fight stops being symbolic, where it's no longer just speeches and protests, no longer chants and banners. A moment when power decides, enough, we're done playing. For Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, that moment didn't come with a warning. It came with force. By the late 1950s and into the years after Nigeria's independence, Funmilayo had already given decades of her life to the struggle. She had fought colonial rule, she had fought unjust kings, she had fought systems designed to keep women silent. And she had won battles that were never supposed to be winnable. But freedom, she knew, was not a finish line. It was a fight that changed shape. Nigeria was now independent, but the power structures Funmilayo had spent her life resisting, they didn't disappear. They simply changed hands. And some of the new leaders were just as uncomfortable with dissent as the old colonial rulers had been, especially dissent led by a woman who refused to step aside. Funmilayo didn't soften her voice after independence. If anything, she became sharper. She criticized corruption openly, she challenged military authority, she condemned injustice, whether it came from foreign rulers or Nigerian elites. Her message stayed consistent. oppression is oppression, no matter who is in charge. And once again, that made her dangerous. By now, her home was no longer just a home. It was a symbol. It represented resistance. It represented defiance. It represented everything authority wanted under control. And symbols are always targets. Her son, Fela, had grown into a loud, unapologetic artist. His music spoke truth in ways politicians hated. His compound, the Kalakuta Republic, became a hub for protest, art, and rebellion. And everyone knew one thing. Fela's fire came from somewhere. It came from Funmilayo. She wasn't just his mother. She was his foundation. That connection made her vulnerable, because when power can't silence the voice, it attacks the roots. One day, the unthinkable happened. Security forces stormed the Kalakuta compound. It wasn't a peaceful visit. It wasn't a discussion. It was violence. Chaos erupted. People were beaten, property was destroyed, music was silenced with force. And in the middle of it all, an elderly woman stood her ground. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti. She was in her late 70s, decades removed from the days when she marched at the front of thousands. But age hadn't taken her courage. She confronted the chaos with the same defiance she had always shown. And for that, she paid a devastating price. She was injured during the attack, not because she was a threat, not because she fought back, but because she stood there, unafraid. The injuries were serious, life-changing, and from that moment on, her health never fully recovered. This is the part history sometimes rushes past, but it matters because it shows the true cost of resistance. Not the glamorous parts, not the victory speeches, the aftermath, the pain, the quiet suffering that comes when the cameras are gone. Funmilayo didn't die immediately. She lived, and that survivor, that itself was its own form of rebellion. She continued to speak when she could, to advise, to inspire. Even as her body weakened, her spirit didn't bend. But the damage had been done. Imagine giving your entire life to justice. Imagine surviving colonialism, imprisonment, harassment, exile from global spaces. Imagine being attacked not for something you did in that moment, but for everything you represented, and still choosing not to regret it. That was Funmilayo. In the years that followed, her presence became quieter, but heavier. When she spoke, people listened, not because she was loud, but because she had earned every word. She had seen the birth of modern Nigeria, and she had seen its failures. She had watched women move from the margins into the conversation and knew how much further there was to go. She had fought kings, she had fought empires, she had fought her own government. And she never once apologized for it. On April 13th, 1978, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti passed away. Her death wasn't sudden. It was the final chapter of a life that had been under attack for decades, and the country felt it. But here's the thing about legacies. They don't end when a life does. They echo. At her funeral, thousands gathered, not just to mourn, but to remember, to honor a woman who refused to shrink even when the world demanded it, to acknowledge a truth Nigeria could not deny. Without Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, the fight for women's rights, for accountability, for fearless resistance would not look the same. She didn't just raise a revolutionary. She raised a generation of women who spoke louder, of activists who stood firmer, of citizens who questioned authority instead of worshipping it. And even in death, power couldn't erase her influence because her ideas lived on in classrooms, in protests, in music, in conversations whispered and shouted across the country. But the story still isn't finished because legacies don't just belong to the past. They challenge the present.
Some people make noise in history. Others change the rules. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti did both. By the time her voice grew quieter, the world around her was already different because she had been in it. And that's what makes her legacy impossible to ignore. To understand what Funmilayo truly changed, you have to understand what existed before her. Before Funmilayo, Nigerian women were expected to survive, but not to lead. To work, but not to question. To suffer, but not to organize. Politics was a men-only conversation. Decisions were made above women's heads, even when women carried the weight of the economy on their backs. Markets ran because of women. Homes survived because of women. Communities functioned because of women. Yet, power pretended they didn't exist. Funmilayo shattered that lie. She proved that women weren't powerless. They were unrecognized power. And once recognized, everything changed. The Abeokuta Women's Union didn't just protest taxes, it rewrote political participation. For the first time, thousands of women realized they didn't need permission to demand justice. They didn't need titles. They didn't need approval from men who had never protected them. They had numbers, they had strategy, they had each other. That formula still works today. Funmilayo also changed how leadership looked. She didn't rule from a throne or an office. She led from the streets, from classrooms, from meetings where everyone's voice mattered. She listened before she spoke. That made her dangerous to systems built on silence. And let's talk about education, because this was one of her quiet revolutions. Funmilayo believed education wasn't just about reading books. It was about unlearning fear. She taught girls that their thoughts mattered, that disagreement wasn't disrespect, that obedience wasn't the same as wisdom. That mindset didn't stay in classrooms. It spilled into homes, into markets, into politics. That's how change spreads. Then there's the part of her legacy that still makes people uncomfortable. She never softened her criticism to make power feel safe. Colonial rule, she challenged it. Traditional authority, she questioned it. Independent Nigeria, she held it accountable. Funmilayo didn't believe oppression changed just because the face of leadership changed. She believed justice required pressure, constant pressure. That belief is still radical. And here's the thing many people miss. Funmilayo didn't fight alone. She built systems. She made sure movements didn't collapse without her. She trained women to organize, to negotiate, to resist peacefully but effectively. That's why her impact outlived her. Movements survive when they are bigger than one person. She understood that early. Her influence also traveled far beyond Nigeria. She connected African women's struggles to global movements for equality and self-determination. She showed that what happened in a market in Abeokuta mattered just as much as debates in foreign capitals. That was bold, because colonial power depended on Africans believing their struggles were small. Funmilayo knew better. And then there's motherhood. Not the soft-focus version history likes to show, but the real one. She raised children who questioned authority, who used their voices unapologetically, who believed art, music, and ideas could shake systems. Fela didn't come from nowhere. His defiance had roots, deep ones. But Funmilayo's legacy isn't just about famous names. It lives in every Nigerian woman who speaks up in a meeting, every market leader who negotiates instead of submitting, every activist who refuses to be polite in the face of injustice. It lives in courage that feels inherited. Still, legacy is complicated because honoring someone like Funmilayo means asking uncomfortable questions. Why did it take so long for her story to be taught widely? Why are women like her remembered quietly, while men with fewer risks taken are celebrated loudly? Why does her fight still feel unfinished? Those questions matter because memory is political too. Funmilayo didn't want statues.
She wanted systems to change. She wanted women at decision-making tables. She wanted leaders held accountable. She wanted silence replaced with participation. And while progress has been made, the work isn't done. So that's why her story keeps resurfacing, not as nostalgia, but as a challenge. A reminder that real change is uncomfortable, that progress always meets resistance, that courage often comes with consequences. Funmilayo knew that, and she chose courage anyway. She once stood in a world that told women to sit down, and she stood so firmly that the ground shifted. But here's the most powerful part of her legacy. She didn't see herself as extraordinary. She saw injustice and responded. That means her story isn't about being special. It's about being brave. And bravery, that's transferable. Which brings us to now. Because if Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti were alive today, what would she be saying? Who would she be challenging? What systems would she be questioning? And would we be ready to listen?
Some people die and the noise around them fades. Others live and somehow the room gets louder. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was the second kind, because even after her voice fell silent, her presence never did. History often tries to wrap women like Funmilayo in soft language. Pioneer, activist, first woman to... But those words don't capture her weight. Funmilayo wasn't just first. She was disruptive. She didn't politely knock on the door of power. She shook the building and demanded answers. If you listen closely, you can still hear her questions echoing. Why do leaders rule without accountability? Why do women carry society but get no say in it? Why does power fear organized voices more than violence? These questions didn't expire with her lifetime. They are still unanswered. That's why Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti doesn't feel like history. It feels like now. Look around. Women organizing against unfair policies. Young people challenging systems they inherited but didn't choose. Artists, teachers, traders, students refusing to stay silent. That energy, it's familiar. It's the same energy Funmilayo ignited decades ago, just wearing new clothes. She taught us something timeless. You don't need permission to resist injustice. You don't need perfection. You don't need power handed to you. You need clarity. You need courage. And you need community. Funmilayo understood that movements don't start in parliaments. They start in conversations, in shared frustration, in collective enough is enough. She turned everyday pain into organized action. And that's still the blueprint. Her life also tells a harder truth, that courage has consequences, that speaking up can cost you comfort, safety, peace. She paid those costs in full. And yet, she never wished her voice back into silence. That matters because it reminds us that bravery isn't loud confidence. It's choosing to act even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Funmilayo never pretended the fight would be easy. She just refused to let that be an excuse. And let's talk about memory. Because how we remember people like her says a lot about who we value. For a long time, her story lived in footnotes, in sidebars, in special mentions. But Funmilayo was never meant to be background information. She was a headline. And every time her name is spoken, retold, relearned, something is corrected. History becomes more honest. She represents a kind of power that doesn't expire. Not wealth, not weapons, not titles, but moral clarity. The kind that unsettles systems built on injustice. And maybe that's the real reason her story still makes people uncomfortable. Because Funmilayo doesn't let us off the hook. She doesn't allow admiration without reflection. Her life asks us, what are you silent about?
What injustice feels normal because it's familiar? What power benefits from your quiet? Those aren't easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti didn't believe change was someone else's responsibility. She believed it belonged to whoever noticed the problem first. And she noticed everything. Her story also reminds us that feminism in Africa didn't come from outside. It didn't need validation. African women have always resisted, always organized, always fought back. Funmilayo didn't import courage. She amplified what already existed. And when she stood at the intersection of gender, colonialism, tradition, and power, she didn't choose the comfortable path. She chose the honest one, even when it hurt. Today, when young girls raise their voices in classrooms, when women demand seats at tables that once excluded them, when citizens question leaders instead of worshipping them, that's her legacy in motion. Not frozen in time, alive. So no, Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti isn't just a story to be told once. It's a story to be revisited, relearned, reapplied. Because every generation faces its own version of silence and its own chance to break it. She once lived in a world that told her, know your place. And she replied, without apology, I do, and I refuse to stay there. That's the kind of energy that doesn't disappear. It transfers from voice to voice, from fight to fight, from past to future. So when people ask, why should we still talk about Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti? The answer is simple. Because the thing she fought against still exists, and the courage she showed, we still need it. She didn't just make history, she left instructions, and they are still waiting to be followed. Before the walls rose, before the armor shined, before kingdoms whispered her name like a warning, there was a girl. Not a legend, not a warrior, not a queen, just a girl born into a world that had already decided what she couldn't be. This is the story of Queen Amina of Zazzou, and this is how legends begin. Long ago, in the heart of what we now call northern Nigeria, there stood a powerful Hausa city-state known as Zazzou. It wasn't just another city. It was a crossroads of trade, culture, and ambition. Gold passed through its markets. Salt traveled its roads. Stories moved faster than caravans. And at the center of it all sat a royal palace where tradition ruled harder than any king. In that palace, sometime in the 16th century, a child was born to Queen Bakwa Turunku, the ruler of Zazzou. Her name was Amina. And from the moment she arrived, the elders frowned because Amina wasn't supposed to matter. In Zazzou, power followed a script. Men ruled, women advised quietly or not at all. Daughters were raised to marry, not to lead. And yet, Amina didn't come into the world quietly. From a young age, she refused softness. While other children played, Amina watched. While others laughed, she listened. While the palace taught her to walk gracefully, she studied how soldiers moved. She followed the guards. She memorized the weight of weapons with her eyes. She asked questions no one expected from a princess. Questions like, why do we stop our borders here? Why do we trade when we could conquer? Why are women told to step back when strength doesn't know gender? Most adults brushed her off. Some laughed. A few felt uneasy because curiosity like that was dangerous. As Amina grew, so did her reputation. She didn't just want to learn how to fight. She did. Against tradition, against whispers, against expectations that tried to cage her. She trained in secret at first. Late nights, quiet mornings, stolen moments with swords meant for men. And here's the thing nobody expected. she was good. No, she was exceptional. She learned faster than the boys. She adapted quicker than the warriors. She fought smarter, not harder. Where brute strength failed, strategy carried her forward. Soon, secrecy became impossible. The guards noticed, the palace noticed, the court noticed, and suddenly the question wasn't if Amina could fight. It was why she fought like someone who belonged on the battlefield. Her mother, Queen Bakwa, saw it before anyone else did. A ruler herself, rare and powerful, Bakwa understood the cost of leadership. She knew the weight of crowns and the loneliness of command. She watched Amina carefully, and one night, as torches flickered against palace walls, Queen Bakwa made a decision that would change history. She didn't stop her daughter, she supported her, quietly, strategically, carefully. Amina was officially allowed to train, but with that permission came pressure, because now every mistake would be blamed on her gender. Every failure would be proof she never belonged. So Amina couldn't just be good, she had to be undeniable. Years passed. The girl became a woman, and the woman became something Zazzou had never seen before. Amina didn't just train with soldiers, she outperformed them. She didn't just understand warfare, she reimagined it. She studied terrain like a map of possibilities. She read people like open books. She understood fear and how to use it. Soon, when Zazzou went to war, Amina didn't stay behind palace walls. She rode with the army, not as a mascot, not as a symbol, but as a commander. And every time she returned, the stories grew. Stories of impossible victories, stories of swift conquests, stories of an army that moved like a storm, fast, precise, unstoppable. People began whispering her name, not as a princess, but as a weapon. Then the unthinkable happened. Queen Bakwa died, and Zazzou held its breath. Because succession meant chaos, tradition demanded a male ruler, bloodline complicated everything, politics sharpened their knives. For a moment, Amina stepped back, not because she was weak, but because she was watching, learning, waiting. The throne passed briefly to her brother, Karama, and while he ruled, Amina didn't disappear. She served, she observed, she planned. She strengthened the army, she expanded influence quietly, she prepared for something no one else could see coming. When Karama died 10 years later, the kingdom faced a choice: stick to tradition or step into the future. Zazzou chose Amina. When she was crowned queen, silence fell over the city. People didn't cheer immediately, they stared. A woman on the throne? A warrior queen, a ruler who wore armor instead of softness. Then Amina stood, and in that moment, history shifted. She didn't promise peace, she promised power. She didn't ask for loyalty, she commanded it. Her first decree wasn't about comfort or diplomacy, it was about expansion. Because Queen Amina didn't intend to rule a city, she intended to build an empire. And that is only the beginning, because next comes the wars, the walls, the legend that would echo across West Africa. Power doesn't announce itself, it moves. And when Queen Amina took the throne of Zazzou, she didn't sit still long enough for doubt to catch up. She went to war. The crown had barely settled on her head when the neighboring kingdoms started talking. Not openly, not boldly, but behind closed doors, across dinner tables, through messengers who traveled fast and whispered faster. A woman rules Zazzou now. She's young, she's reckless, she'll fall. They said what people always say when the world shifts and they're scared of it. They underestimated her. And Amina, she let them. Zazzou wasn't weak, but it wasn't feared either. Yet. It was a city-state boxed in by rivals, trade routes controlled by others, borders drawn by past rulers who played it safe. Queen Amina didn't believe in safe. She believed in control. So instead of defending Zazzou, she expanded it. Instead of reacting to threats, she became one. Her strategy was simple and terrifying. Move fast, strike hard, leave no room for recovery. No endless sieges, no drawn-out battles, no mercy that invited revenge. Amina studied her enemies like puzzles. She learned their habits, their weaknesses, their pride, and then she broke them. Her army didn't look like anyone else's. They were lighter, faster, more disciplined. While other armies marched slow and loud, Amina's forces moved like shadows. They attacked at dawn, at dusk, sometimes in the dead of night. And leading them, always, was Queen Amina herself. Not watching from the back, not protected behind generals. She rode at the front, armor gleaming, spear steady, eyes locked forward. The sight alone shattered morale. Because how do you fight an army whose queen isn't afraid to bleed beside her soldiers? The first kingdom to fall didn't even realize what was happening until it was over. A border city, wealthy, arrogant, poorly defended, thought Zazzou would never dare. They were wrong. Amina's forces struck before reinforcements could arrive. The gates fell, the resistance crumbled, the city surrendered. And instead of destroying it, Amina did something unexpected. She fortified it. She reinforced its walls, installed loyal governors, secured its trade routes. She didn't just conquer, she kept. That's when the region started paying attention. Because this wasn't chaos. This was planning. Kingdom after kingdom fell into line. Some resisted and lost. Some surrendered early. Some tried to bargain. Amina accepted none of the excuses. She expanded Zazzou's reach across lands that had never answered to a single ruler before. Her territory stretched wider. Her influence grew deeper. Her name traveled farther than her army ever could. Children whispered it. Merchants feared it. Rulers lost sleep over it. Queen Amina wasn't just winning battles. She was rewriting the map. But here's what made her truly dangerous. She understood psychology. Fear wasn't enough. Respect mattered. So Amina built something no one had ever done at this scale. Walls. Massive defensive walls around conquered cities, later known as Amina's walls. These weren't just protection, they were statements. Every wall said, "This city is mine. This land is secure. This empire is permanent." Some of those walls still stand today. Think about that. Stone remembers her. As her empire expanded, the rumors grew wilder. They said she never lost a battle. They said her spear was enchanted. They said she didn't age. They said she couldn't be killed. Truth blurred into myth. And Amina didn't correct anyone, because legends fight harder than soldiers ever could. But power attracts enemies. And the farther Amina pushed, the more resistance sharpened. Coalitions formed quietly. Rivals united out of fear. Kings who once hated each other now shared one goal: stop Queen Amina. Because if she kept going, there would be nothing left to stop her. One alliance stronger than the rest prepared for her. They gathered troops, stockpiled weapons, fortified their cities. They believed numbers would save them. They believed unity would overpower strategy. They believed wrong. Amina saw the threat coming and welcomed it, because this wasn't just another conquest. This was a message. The battlefield was wide and unforgiving. Dust filled the air. The sun burned overhead. Thousands of soldiers stood ready. Across the field, the enemy commanders laughed. A woman queen against this? They expected hesitation. What they got was precision. Amina split her forces, feigned retreat, lured them forward, then closed the trap. Her cavalry hit from the sides, her infantry surged forward. The alliance collapsed into confusion. Orders contradicted, lines broke, fear spread. By the time the dust settled, the alliance was finished. Some fled, some surrendered, some never rose again. And Queen Amina stood victorious again. After that battle, resistance changed. People didn't ask if Amina would come. They asked when, and whether surrendering early would save them. Yet, despite the victories, Amina didn't rule through terror alone. She secured trade routes, protected merchants, encouraged wealth to flow freely through her empire. Under her rule, Zazzou didn't just grow stronger, it grew richer, safer, more connected than ever before. She understood something rare. An empire survives on more than fear. It survives on structure. But legends demand sacrifice. Amina never married, never stepped away from command, never allowed herself softness. Some say it was choice. Some say it was duty. Some say she loved freedom more than companionship. Whatever the reason, her devotion was absolute. She belonged to the battlefield, to the throne, to history. And as years passed, her name stopped being questioned. No more woman ruler, no more doubt. Just Queen Amina, the warrior, the builder, the conqueror. But every legend has a shadow. At some point, power stops being measured in land and starts being measured in fear. By the time Queen Amina had ruled for years, people no longer spoke her name casually. They lowered their voices. They looked over their shoulders. They told stories that felt half true and fully terrifying. Because Queen Amina wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was a legend that walked. Travelers carried the stories first. Merchants crossing deserts, messengers riding through the night, wanderers who claimed they had seen her army move like a living thing. They said she never lost. They said she never retreated. They said wherever her spear touched the ground, that land would never be free again. And then the stories changed. They always do. Some said Queen Amina didn't sleep. Others claimed she bathed in cold rivers before battle to harden her spirit. Some whispered that she took lovers from conquered lands and that none ever stayed until morning. No one knew what was real anymore. But here's the truth about legends. They don't need facts. They need belief. And belief was spreading faster than her armies ever could. In distant kingdoms, rulers started preparing for her arrival even when she was nowhere near them. They built walls taller than they could afford. They trained soldiers they would never use. They paid tribute in advance, just in case. Queen Amina had become inevitable. Not a threat, a future. But inside her empire, the reality was more complex. Expansion had a cost. Her soldiers were loyal but tired. Her generals were skilled but cautious. Her people were prosperous but stretched thin. An empire that grows too fast begins to strain itself. Amina knew this. She felt it in the quiet moments, in the pauses between campaigns, in the weight of decisions no one else could make. Every victory asks the same question: how much farther? Yet, stopping felt impossible, because Queen Amina didn't just conquer land, she conquered expectations. To pause would invite doubt. To slow down would invite rebellion. To rest would give her enemies hope. So, she kept moving. And with every step forward, the myths grew stronger. They said her shadow frightened enemies before battle even began. They said arrows bent away from her. They said she could see the outcome of wars before they were fought. Her soldiers started believing it too. And belief is dangerous. Because when people stop seeing you human, they stop letting you be human. Amina noticed the distance growing. Between her and her court, between her and her generals, between her and her people. They didn't speak freely around her anymore. They waited for orders instead of offering counsel. They obeyed, but they no longer challenged her. And for a ruler, silence is the most dangerous sound of all. Still, there was no turning back. The empire was too large, her name too heavy, her legacy already forming. And then came the campaign that would define her final years. A region far beyond Zazzou's original borders, wealthy, stubborn, and proud. They refused tribute, refused surrender, refused her authority. Not because they didn't fear her, but because they believed legends couldn't bleed. They were wrong, but so was Amina about how much this war would take from her. The campaign dragged on longer than any before it, not because her enemies were stronger, but because they were smarter. They avoided open battle, harassed supply lines, retreated into difficult terrain. It was warfare without glory, slow, grinding, exhausting. For the first time in her life, Queen Amina faced something she couldn't overpower with force alone: time. Her soldiers grew restless. Victories felt hollow. Losses felt heavier. The magic of invincibility began to crack. Whispers returned, but this time they weren't about her strength. They were about her limits. And Amina heard them. Every ruler does. She pushed harder, demanded more, moved faster, refused to show weakness. Because if the legend broke, everything broke. But legends aren't armor. They are weight. One night, after a skirmish that brought no clear victory, Amina sat alone. No advisors, no guards nearby. Just her thoughts and the firelight. She thought about her mother, about Zazzou before the wars, about the girl who once trained in secret with stolen weapons. She wondered briefly what another life might have been. Then she stood, and the queen returned. The final battles of her reign weren't the largest. They were the hardest, because they weren't about conquest. They were about control. Holding what she had built, maintaining order across vast distances, preventing rebellion without crushing the people she ruled. This was leadership without applause. History rarely remembers this part, but it's the part that matters most. As the years passed, Queen Amina aged, slowly, quietly, stubbornly. She still rode with her army, still wore armor, still commanded respect with a glance. But the invincible warrior had become something else, a symbol. And symbols don't get to rest. The stories say she died on campaign. Some claim it was during battle, others say it was sudden illness. Some insist she never truly died at all. History doesn't agree, and maybe that's fitting, because Queen Amina had already crossed into myth. But here's what is certain. When news of her death spread, the world didn't celebrate. It paused. Enemies didn't cheer. Rivals didn't mock. Even those she conquered felt the loss of something enormous. Because for decades, the world had revolved around one unstoppable force. And suddenly, it was gone. When Queen Amina died, the world didn't collapse, but it shifted. Because for decades, her presence had been the constant, the pressure, the force holding everything together. And once that force was gone, everything had to figure out how to stand on its own. News of her death didn't spread fast. People didn't want to believe it. How could someone like that be gone? Some thought it was enemy propaganda. Others believed she had disappeared on purpose, waiting, watching. A few insisted she would return when Zazzou needed her most. That's what legends do. They refused to end cleanly. But eventually, reality arrived. Queen Amina was gone. And the empire she built now had to answer the hardest question of all. What happens after greatness? Zazzou remained powerful on paper. The borders were still wide, the trade routes still active, the walls still standing. But power without presence is fragile. Amina had ruled through momentum, through fear mixed with respect, through a personal authority no successor could replicate. Her successors inherited land, but not her gravity. The generals argued. Some wanted to keep expanding, chasing her legacy like a shadow they could never catch. Others wanted consolidation, fewer wars, stronger internal control. The court was divided. Because Amina hadn't just ruled, she had defined how ruling worked, and now everyone had opinions on how to continue her story. Outside the empire, rivals tested the silence. Small rebellions fled. Old enemies whispered again. Border cities hesitated. Not full war, just pressure, like tapping cracked glass to see where it breaks. But here's the thing no one expected. Queen Amina's systems held. The walls slowed invasions. The trade routes kept wealth flowing. The governors she placed carefully, deliberately kept order. She had planned for a future without her, even if no one noticed at the time. Still, something was missing. The confidence, the certainty, the belief that Zazzou was unstoppable, because that belief had worn one face, and now that face existed only in memory. Meanwhile, the stories of Queen Amina grew bigger, not smaller. She stopped being discussed as a ruler and started being spoken of as something timeless. Mothers told her story to daughters, warriors invoked her name before battle, poets exaggerated her victories until they blurred into magic. And slowly, history turned into folklore. Some stories said she ruled for over 30 years without defeat. Others claimed she personally conquered dozens of cities alone. Some said she never slept in the same place twice. Were this true? Does it matter? Because the idea of Queen Amina was now more powerful than the woman ever was. In a world that tried to erase women from power, her name refused to fade. She became proof that leadership wasn't limited by gender, proof that strategy mattered more than brute force, proof that strength could look different and still dominate. And that made some people uncomfortable. For generations, historians downplayed her, called her reign exaggerated, questioned her achievements, reduced her to myth to avoid admitting her reality. Because accepting Queen Amina meant accepting that history had been wrong about who could rule, and not everyone was ready for that. But oral tradition is stubborn. Stories passed mouth to mouth don't care about textbooks. They care about memory, and memory kept her alive. Over time, Zazzou evolved. Borders shifted, empires rose and fell, new powers replaced old ones. But Queen Amina's name survived every transition. Because she wasn't tied to a single moment. She represented something bigger. Defiance. She was remembered as the woman who refused limits, the queen who chose armor over approval, the ruler who expanded not just territory, but possibility. And that's why her story didn't die with her. Centuries later, people still point to ruins and say, these are Amina's walls. Still argue about where her campaigns reached, still debate what parts of her story are real. That debate is her victory. Because forgotten rulers don't get argued about. Today, Queen Amina stands as a symbol across Africa and beyond. Not perfect, not mythical, but undeniable. A reminder that history is louder than tradition and courage outlives crowns. But there's one final piece one last reason her story still hits so hard. Because Queen Amina didn't just change her world. She changed how future generations imagined theirs.
History is full of names, kings, conquerors, rulers who took power and lost it just as fast. Most of them fade. But every once in a while, a name refuses to disappear. Queen Amina is one of those names. Centuries have passed since she rode at the front of her army. The world has changed, borders redrawn, empires erased, cities rebuilt on top of ruins. And yet, say her name in northern Nigeria today and people still recognize it. Say it across Africa and it still carries weight. Say it anywhere stories of strength are told and it still means something. That doesn't happen by accident. Queen Amina didn't survive history because she conquered land. Plenty of people did that. She survived because she shattered an idea. The idea that leadership had one face, one gender, one shape. She existed in a world that told her no before she ever spoke, and she answered with action. Think about what she did. Really think about it. She ruled in a time when women were expected to be invisible in power. She led armies when leadership was defined by masculinity. She expanded an empire when she was expected to stay contained. She didn't ask permission to be remembered. She forced memory to make room for her. And that's why her story still hits. Because Queen Amina represents possibility. Not the fairy tale kind, the hard kind, the kind that costs you comfort, the kind that demands sacrifice, the kind that doesn't guarantee praise while you're alive. She wasn't perfect. She was relentless. She was demanding. She made enemies. She lived a life shaped by war. But she was real. And real women in power are often treated like legends or threats, anything but human. Queen Amina carried that weight before the world even had language for it. Today, when people look back and ask, were there ever powerful African queens? Did women ever rule before modern times? Is leadership something we invented recently? Her name answers all of it, without explanation, without apology. Statues have been built in her honor. Schools are named after her. Her story is taught, debated, reclaimed, and still it's not finished. Because every generation finds something new in her. For some, Queen Amina is about courage. For others, she's about ambition. For many, she's about refusing to shrink just to make others comfortable. She speaks to artists, to leaders, to young people being told they are too much or not meant for that. She's proof that history doesn't only belong to those who fit the mold. And here's the part people don't say enough. Queen Amina didn't wait to be understood. She acted anyway. She didn't soften herself to be accepted, didn't rewrite herself to be palatable, didn't slow down to ease fear. She moved forward and let history catch up later. That's rare. That's powerful. Her legacy isn't just walls or battles, it's imagination. She expanded what people believed was possible. And once that door opens, it never fully closes again. That's why her story still demands retelling. Because every time it's told, someone hears it and thinks, maybe I don't have to follow the script either. Queen Amina didn't just rule Zazzou, she ruled her moment. And moments like that echo. So when the story ends, it doesn't really end. It waits for the next person who refuses limits, for the next voice history tries to ignore, for the next legend who hasn't been named yet. Because Queen Amina proved one final truth. Legends aren't born, they're built. Choice by choice, battle by battle, refusal by refusal. And once they're built, time can't tear them down.
This was the story of Queen Amina of Zazzou. And if people are still listening, it means the legend did exactly what it was meant to do.
Picture the Atlantic at dawn. The water doesn't just move, it breathes, slow, heavy, ancient. And along the coast of the Niger Delta, before borders had names and maps had lines, the tide carried more than salt and foam. It carried destiny. This is not a story about a man who was born powerful. Nah, this is a story about a man who took power back. His name would one day shake empires. Merchants would whisper it. Governors would fear it. Kings would measure themselves against it. But before he was Jaja of Opobo, king, trader, gatekeeper of the oil rivers, he was something else entirely. He was property. He was born in the early 1800s among the Igbo people, deep inland, far from the smell of the sea. His birth name was Jubo Juboga, a name meant for a free child, meant to grow old among his people. But history had other plans: war, raids, chains. One violent night, the kind history doesn't like to slow down for, Jubo was taken, torn from his home, from his language, from the arms that raised him. He was sold south, passed from hand to hand like an object until the salt air replaced forest wind. He arrived in Bonny, one of the most powerful trading states on the coast. Bonny wasn't just a town, it was a machine. Palm oil flowed through it like blood. European ships docked daily, British, Portuguese, hungry for oil to fuel their factories and ships. And Bonny stood between the interior and the sea, controlling the gates. At the top of this machine were the Wari houses, powerful trading families, each with followers, slaves, and armed men. Jubo was absorbed into one of these houses, the Ana Pepe house, ruled by King Opobo Pepe. To the world, Jubo was owned, but inside Jubo, something refused to kneel. Slavery in Bonny wasn't just chains and whips. It was hierarchy, strategy, survival of the sharpest. A smart slave could rise, a foolish free man could fall. And Jubo was sharp. He listened more than he spoke. He watched who controlled the canoes, who spoke to the Europeans, who decided which river was open and which was closed. He learned numbers, he learned prices, he learned timing, when to wait, when to strike. While others saw muscle, King Pepe saw mind. Jubo became a trusted agent, then a canoe master, then a trade negotiator. He commanded men, he led expeditions upriver, he brought back wealth. Slowly, quietly, he became indispensable. And here's the wild part, the part history smiles at. The man who once owned him freed him. Jubo wasn't just free now, he was powerful. So powerful that King Pepe gave him a new name, Jaja. A name that meant strength, a name that sounded like a drumbeat. But Bonny had a problem. Power hates sharing space. As Jubo's influence grew, jealousy followed. Other houses watched their profits shrink, while Jaja's canoes returned heavy with oil. His followers multiplied. His voice carried weight in council meetings. The old balance was cracking. And when King Pepe died, the cracks turned into open wounds. Bonny exploded into a power struggle. Two factions, two visions. On one side, the royal house, clinging to tradition. On the other, Jaja and his allies, representing a new order, wealth over bloodline, ability over ancestry. The fight wasn't just political, it was economic. Who controlled the rivers? Who spoke to the Europeans? Who decided the price of oil? Bonny tried to cage Jaja. They failed. Instead of bowing, Jaja did something unthinkable. He walked away. Not alone, not quietly. He gathered his followers, thousands of men, women, families, canoes, trade goods, and moved east down the coast to a quiet stretch of land near the Imo River, where mangroves stood thick and tides ran deep. There, in 1869, Jaja founded a new state. He named it Opobo, not after himself, not after a god, but after the king who once owned him, a final poetic flex. Bonny laughed, the Europeans shrugged. They thought he would fail. They were wrong. Opobo rose not slowly, it erupted. Jaja positioned the town like a chess master placing his queen. Every canoe coming from the interior had to pass through Opobo waters to reach the sea. No shortcut, no backdoor. And Jaja made one rule: no European trader goes upriver. If you want oil, you buy from him. British merchants were furious, but they had no choice. Jaja controlled the flow. And when you control the flow, you control the future. Opobo grew rich. Schools, courts, order. Jaja ruled with discipline. Theft was punished. Loyalty was rewarded. Trade was regulated. His state became one of the most organized and prosperous on the coast. British captains saluted him. Governors wrote his name in reports. And for the first time, a formerly enslaved African man stood as an equal in negotiations with the British Empire. But empires don't like equals. They like doors. And Jaja was a wall. In the next part, the British will come smiling, with pens, with treaties, with promises, and Jaja of Opobo will face the most dangerous weapon of all, not guns, but diplomacy.
Empires don't always arrive with guns first. Sometimes they arrive smiling. Sometimes they arrive with gifts, handshakes, and paper. And in the early 1870s, the British Empire arrived in Opobo exactly like that. By now, Opobo was impossible to ignore. What started as a bold walkout from Bonny had become one of the most powerful trading states on the Niger Delta. Palm oil flowed through Jaja's territory in endless streams, thick, golden, and priceless to British industry. Factories in Liverpool, machines in Manchester, ships across the Atlantic, all of them depended on oil. And one African king, formerly enslaved, self-made, strategic, controlled the gate. Jaja of Opobo. To the British, that was a problem. Not because he was violent, not because he was chaotic, but because he was effective. You see, the British had a plan for West Africa. They wanted free trade. Sounds innocent, right? But free trade didn't mean freedom for everyone. It meant freedom for them. It meant European traders sailing straight upriver, bypassing African middlemen, setting prices, breaking local power structures, and turning kings into ceremonial figures. And Jaja? Jaja said no. His policy was simple. If you want palm oil, you buy it from Opobo. No European canoe beyond the coast. No British agent in the interior. That wasn't arrogance. That was survival. Because Jaja understood something many rulers didn't yet see. Once you lose control of trade, you lose control of everything. The British response wasn't immediate violence. It was diplomacy. Governors sent letters praising Jaja's wisdom and leadership. Merchants visited his court with flattery dripping from every word. Treaties were drafted, long, confusing documents written in English legal language. They spoke of friendship, protection, peace, but buried in the lines were traps. Clauses about free navigation, equal access, British oversight. Jaja read them carefully, and every time he refused to sign. This shocked the British. They were used to kings who signed without reading, who trusted translators, who didn't fully understand the consequences. But Jaja wasn't guessing. He asked questions, he delayed, he negotiated. Sometimes he agreed to small concessions, never the core. And slowly, British frustration turned into something darker. Behind closed doors, reports were written. They described Jaja as obstructive, uncooperative, a barrier to progress. But what they really meant was, this man cannot be controlled. Meanwhile, Opobo kept thriving. Trade routes were organized, disputes were settled quickly, crime was punished. Jaja ruled with discipline, but also with vision.
He sent young men to learn European languages. He welcomed missionaries but limited their influence. He modernized without surrendering control. Opobo wasn't anti-Europe, it was anti-exploitation. And that distinction made the British nervous. Then came the incident, the one that would change everything. A British trader attempted to bypass Opobo's authority, sneaking goods upriver, breaking Jaja's trade laws. Jaja responded swiftly. The trader was detained, not harmed, not tortured, just stopped. But to the British Empire, that was unforgivable, because in their eyes, no African ruler had the right to detain a British subject, especially not one who used to be enslaved. From that moment, the tone shifted. No more friendly letters, no more polite requests. Now they were threats. Warships appeared offshore, silent, floating reminders of power. Governors spoke of maintaining order. Merchants demanded intervention. And yet, Jaja still believed in reason. He believed the British would see sense. He underestimated their pride. In 1887, the British governor of the Niger Coast Protectorate invited Jaja to negotiations, a meeting, a discussion, a chance to resolve misunderstandings. Jaja hesitated. Some of his chiefs warned him, this invitation smells wrong. But Jaja had never been afraid of dialogue. He believed truth would protect him. So he agreed. When Jaja boarded the British ship, he did so as a king, dressed in royal cloth, surrounded by attendants, confident. He did not come in chains, but he would leave in them. The meeting was a lie. The moment Jaja stepped aboard, he was informed that he was under arrest. No trial, no debate, just an accusation. Obstruction of free trade. The same crime that had justified conquest across the globe. Jaja protested. He reminded them of treaties, of cooperation, of years of peaceful trade. The British listened, then ignored him, because the decision had already been made. Jaja of Opobo, king, strategist, gatekeeper of the oil rivers, was exiled. Not imprisoned nearby, but removed, far away, first to Accra, then to the West Indies, away from his people, away from his power, away from the rivers he controlled. Opobo mourned. The state weakened. British traders flooded inland. The gates fell open. Free trade had arrived, and it looked a lot like conquest. But here's the thing about Jaja's story. This wasn't the end, because even in exile, Jaja did not disappear. His name became a warning, a lesson, a blueprint.
Jaja's exile was like stepping into another world. The ships carried him away from Opobo, away from the rivers he had controlled, away from the people who had followed him with loyalty forged over decades. Accra first, then the Caribbean, strange lands with sunburned sands and unfamiliar languages. The air smelt different. The food was strange. The rhythms of life were not his own. Yet, Jaja survived, because survival was coded into him from birth. He had survived slavery, betrayal, and wars he hadn't fought yet. And now, in exile, the challenge was different. It was quiet, slow, and insidious. He found himself walking streets where nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew the story of a man who had once owned the rivers and the tides themselves. To them, he was a stranger, a foreigner, a man without the power that had defined him. At night, he lay awake and remembered the mangroves, the tides, the sound of canoes hitting the water under his command. Memories burned, sweet and painful at the same time. In Opobo, he had been a king. Here, he was merely a man, and men like him were powerless. But even in exile, Jaja's mind never rested. He studied the British, their trade patterns, their habits. He wrote letters to sympathetic traders, learning who had been loyal, who had betrayed him. Even stripped of command, he remained a strategist. Sickness came next. Tropical fevers, infections, exhaustion from travel, and the psychological weight of isolation. Many men would have withered, many would have given up, but Jaja knew that yielding now would mean that his people and his state would be lost forever. His health became a battleground, his body weakened, but his mind sharpened. Meanwhile, back in Opobo, the British learned what they had done. Removing Jaja did not bring the smooth control they had imagined. Instead, disarray emerged. The trade networks he had established became chaotic. Chiefs argued, factions splintered, and the European traders realized that the absence of Jaja's guiding hand had created more problems than it had solved. Opobo had been strong because of him. Without him, it faltered. Rumors of Jaja's exile spread, traveling along the rivers and coastlines. Merchants, sailors, and travelers whispered his name. Young leaders learned his strategies. Mothers told their children about the man who had risen from slavery to command kings. Even far from home, his influence was felt. Jaja wrote letters too. Some were intercepted, some delivered. They contained advice, warnings, and sometimes pleas. But through it all, his voice remained a warning. Remove me if you must, but you cannot remove what I have built. Isolation tested his relationships. Allies he trusted were far away, and new faces were uncertain. Deception was constant. Some sought to use him for their own gain, others to betray him to the British. Jaja always read people, but the exile world was a constant trial. Trust became a currency more valuable than gold. He learned patience in ways he never had before. Whereas before he had been able to act, to command, now he could only plan. Every decision had to be calculated against the long shadow of time and distance. Every letter sent, every contact made, every move in exile was a chess piece carefully placed. Years passed. The rivers of Opobo still flowed and people still remembered. But the man himself was far, far away, and yet his legend grew. Eventually, sickness caught up with him. His body weakened. He realized the truth that no strategy could defend against. Mortality is the one enemy even a king cannot outmaneuver. But as he lay ill, he reflected not on what he had lost, but on what he had created. The towns he had built, the trade networks he had controlled, the people he had elevated, and the standards he had set were his legacy. That could not be taken. Even in his last moments, Jaja remained more than a man. He was a symbol of resilience, strategy, and the assertion that even those born into chains could claim agency and command history. When Jaja passed, his name did not fade. European traders wrote reports of the legendary king of Opobo, remembering his cleverness and the strength of his state. African leaders recounted his story to inspire generations. The rivers he had ruled continued to flow, and in them the echo of his leadership remained. And the lesson was clear. Empires may rise and fall. Kings may exile and imprison, but a visionary who shapes the world leaves a legacy that not even distance or death can erase. Jaja's story was not over. His ideas, strategies, and courage continued to inspire, proving that power and vision are never fully bound even by the strongest chains. Even with Jaja in exile, the rivers of Opobo did not forget him. The traders who had once followed his orders, the chiefs who had obeyed his law, and the people who had built their lives under his guidance felt a vacuum that no British order could fill. Opobo was supposed to be under British control now, but control without understanding is brittle. The Europeans arrived expecting compliance, obedience, and smooth profit. Instead, they encountered resistance of a subtler kind, a culture, a system, a mindset that had been forged by Jaja and could not be erased by an empire. Small acts of defiance appeared everywhere. Canoe captains who had once answered to Jaja found ways to bypass British oversight. Merchants spread rumors that Jaja's policies were the proper way to do business, hinting that obedience to the British was temporary and unreliable. Chiefs who had benefited under Jaja subtly reminded people of his rules, his fairness, and the order he had established. The British attempted to enforce stricter laws, but every new regulation met quiet sabotage. Ships arriving from Liverpool were delayed not by guns, but by navigational tricks and slow-moving intermediaries who remembered the discipline Jaja had taught them. Orders were given, then quietly ignored. Accounts were mismanaged on purpose, but only in ways the British could not fully trace. The empire was operating in a world it did not fully understand. Meanwhile, word of Jaja's exile continued to circulate along the coast. Letters, travelers, and traders carried stories of the man who had risen from slavery to rule the rivers. These stories traveled upriver and across the delta, reaching towns and villages that had never directly seen him, yet felt his presence in every trade decision. His legend became a compass, teaching strategy, patience, and courage. Despite the British attempts to reconfigure Opobo, the state still reflected Jaja's design. Market systems he had established remained in use. Dispute mechanisms he had created for fair trade were quietly preserved by chiefs and elders who had seen their value. The structures of Opobo were embedded into the culture itself. They could not be unbuilt with ships and guns alone. Yet, without Jaja's direct guidance, cracks appeared. Rivalries among chiefs escalated. Personal ambitions clashed with collective good. The absence of a unifying hand led to inefficiencies that the British tried to exploit. And in these moments, people remembered Jaja's discipline, his vision, his capacity to organize a state like no one else. Across the Atlantic, Jaja heard fragments of this news. He learned of disruptions, clever maneuvers by those loyal to him, and small victories against British overreach. Each story confirmed what he already knew. Leadership is more than physical presence. Influence, principles, and strategic vision endure beyond exile. The British were beginning to understand that controlling Opobo would never be as simple as removing its king. Power had been cultivated, not stolen. They could occupy, they could intimidate, but they could not instantly erase the mind that had shaped the territory. Jaja's exile became a lesson in subtle resistance. His people, without explicit orders, continued to honor his strategies. Every trade route, every negotiation, every dispute settled according to his principles was a reminder that leadership is not merely about presence, but about the imprint left on a community. And somewhere deep in the delta, the echo of his vision was heard in whispers, in advice to young traders, in the cautious respect that even British officers had to show when they navigated the waterways. Through all of this, the essence of Jaja's genius became clear. You can exile the man, but you cannot exile the ideas that built a state. His legacy was living, breathing, and shaping Opobo in ways even the empire could not suppress. The river currents carried his memory, the mangroves echoed his discipline, and the tides remembered the king who had once commanded them.
Generations later, the rivers of the Niger Delta still whispered Jaja's name, not because of fear, not because of power in the traditional sense, but because of what he had built and what he had embodied. He was a symbol, a living story that could not be erased, a lesson in resilience, strategy, and vision. Even after his death, the trade networks he had established continued to function, albeit adapted by those who remembered his methods. Chiefs and elders told his story to young men and women, not as a tale of conquest, but as a blueprint of leadership. They spoke of discipline, fairness, and the foresight required to balance wealth, people, and power. Every transaction, every negotiation, every decision echoed Jaja's principles. European traders, long accustomed to relying on force and intimidation, realized that Jaja had created something they could not easily manipulate, a system of governance and commerce grounded in trust, accountability, and respect. They had underestimated him, and in doing so, learned that the most formidable forms of power are not always visible. Opobo continued to thrive, even under foreign pressures. Its people carried forward the structures, the rules, and the ethos that Jaja had instilled. When disputes arose, they resolved them with the same fairness and logic that had characterized his rule. When trade decisions were made, they considered efficiency,
loyalty, and the long-term consequences, lessons learned from the man who had once commanded the tides. Jaja's story traveled beyond the Niger Delta. Across West Africa, leaders, traders, and storytellers invoked his name. It became a symbol of self-made authority, of rising from oppression, and of wielding intelligence and strategy as weapons more powerful than guns. Schools thought of his life, and in some corners of the colonial administration, his tactics were studied, albeit reluctantly, as examples of leadership that could not be subverted by brute force alone. His legacy also served as a cautionary tale for empires. Even when a ruler is removed, their influence cannot always be confined. Ideas outlive individuals. Strategies endure. Principles, when embedded in a community, act as invisible currents that shape actions long after the original architect is gone. And so, Jaja of Opobo became more than a man. He became a measure of what is possible, from enslavement to sovereignty, from exile to everlasting influence. He proved that true power is not only in control, but in vision and in the ability to instill that vision so deeply that it continues to guide people when the architect is no longer present. His rivers still flow, carrying more than water. They carry the memory of a king who commanded respect, not with fear, but with intellect and integrity. His mangroves still stand, a living monument to order and foresight. And the tides of Opobo, forever rhythmic and unstoppable, echo the story of a man who changed the course of his people's destiny, leaving a legacy that no empire could wash away. Jaja's life reminds us that power is more than title or territory. It is influence, vision, and resilience. And while empires rise and fall, and kings come and go, the legacy of a true leader, one forged in adversity, shaped by wisdom and sustained by principles, can never be taken away. His story, vibrant and enduring, continues to inspire generations, proving that greatness is not always inherited, but earned and preserved through courage, intellect, and unwavering resolve.
Every great story starts with a moment the world didn't notice. No drums, no spotlight, no prophecy. Just a child in a small town, in a country that didn't yet exist. Ikenne, 1909. Long before Nigeria had a flag, before speeches, elections, and independence songs, before history books and bold headlines, there was a boy named Obafemi Awolowo. He wasn't born into royalty, no powerful surname, no political inheritance, no safety net waiting to catch him. In fact, life took something from him almost immediately. His father, a farmer and sawyer, died when Obafemi Awolowo was still very young. Just like that, childhood ended early. No time to be soft, no time to dream casually. When your father dies in colonial Nigeria, survival becomes your first syllabus. His mother became everything: provider, protector, teacher, disciplinarian. She was strong, but strength doesn't erase poverty. It only teaches you how to endure it. And endurance, Awolowo learnt that early. Music slows, distant market sounds. Colonial Nigeria was not designed for boys like him to arise. The British ruled and Nigerians followed. Authority spoke English. Power wore uniforms. Opportunity lived far away from towns like Ikenne. African children were taught how to obey, not how to lead. But Awolowo was observant. He watched how the British officers carried themselves, how they spoke with confidence, how their laws controlled entire communities. And then he looked around at his own people, smart, capable, creative, yet pushed aside. Somewhere deep inside that young boy, a quiet rebellion began to form. Not loud, not violent, but intellectual. A question that refused to shut up. Why them and not us? School was not smooth. Education required money, and money was scarce. Awolowo walked to jobs most children his age wouldn't even understand. Clerical work,
trading, assisting wherever he could. He studied at night, read by weak lamps, fought exhaustion daily. This wasn't hustle culture. This was necessity. And while other boys played, Awolowo read. Newspapers, political writings, anything that explained power. He discovered something important early. The world is not ruled by strength alone. It is ruled by ideas. That realization changed everything. By his teenage years, Awolowo was already writing, carefully choosing words, sharpening arguments, questioning authority without begging for permission. He became a journalist, and journalism in colonial Nigeria wasn't just a job, it was resistance. Through articles and editorials, he challenged injustice. He criticized colonial systems that drained local communities while claiming to civilize them. He exposed inequality without shouting, calm, logical, precise. That calm scared people more than anger ever could. Because angry men can be dismissed, but thinkers are dangerous. Still, Awolowo wasn't satisfied. Criticism alone wasn't enough. He didn't want just freedom. He wanted direction. And that's where many freedom movements failed. They knew what they were against, but not what they were building. Awolowo wanted to understand how nations work from the inside. So he made a bold move. In the 1940s, when traveling abroad was nearly impossible for the average Nigerian, Obafemi Awolowo packed his bags and left for the United Kingdom. Not to escape Nigeria, but to decode power. Ship horn, ocean waves. London was a shock. The cold, the culture, the class system. But Awolowo didn't come to blend in. He came to observe. He studied law, yes, but more importantly, he studied governance. How laws were written, how institutions were structured, how accountability worked. And slowly, the illusion shattered. Britain wasn't powerful because it was British. It was powerful because it had systems, strong institutions, clear rules, defined responsibilities. And Awolowo realized something that would shape his entire life. That if systems create power, then power can be designed. Nigeria didn't need miracles, it needed structure. While in the UK, he also encountered global political thought, social democracy, welfare states, federalism, ideas that said governments should serve people, not dominate them. These ideas didn't confuse him, they clarified him. He wasn't trying to copy Britain, he was trying to outgrow colonialism. When he finally returned to Nigeria, he wasn't the same man who had left. He came back with a legal mind, a political vision, and zero patience for mediocrity. Nigeria, however, was not ready. The colonial government was still in charge, Nigerian elites were divided, ethnic tensions were rising, and many leaders were focused on positions, not policies. Awolowo stood out. He spoke about structure when others spoke about power. He spoke about education when others spoke about control. He spoke about the future when others argued about the present. People listened, especially the youth, because his message wasn't emotional, it was logical. He wasn't promising miracles, he was promising work. Music intensified slightly. This was the beginning of something dangerous. Because once people understand that their condition isn't destiny, once they realize its design, they start demanding redesign. And redesign threatens those comfortable with broken systems. Obafemi Awolowo was no longer just a poor boy from Ekene, he was becoming a problem. A thinker with a plan, a nationalist with discipline, a man who believed Nigeria could be more than a colony, more than chaos, more than compromise. But he hadn't even reached power yet. This was only the origin story.
History doesn't always change with gunshots. Sometimes it changes with a book. When Obafemi Awolowo returned to Nigeria in the late 1940s, The country was restless. Colonial rule was cracking. Nationalism was rising. Everyone could feel it. But here was the problem. Everyone wanted freedom, yet no one agreed on what freedom should look like. Some wanted independence first and structure later. Some wanted power immediately, consequences later. Some were just chasing titles. Awolowo? He wasn't interested in vibes. He believed freedom without planning was just chaos in disguise. So instead of shouting slogans, he sat down and wrote. And what he wrote would shake the foundation of Nigerian politics. Pause. Path to Nigerian freedom. Not poetry, not propaganda, a blueprint. In this book, Awolowo did something most politicians avoid. He told the truth clearly. Nigeria, he argued, was not one people pretending to be many. It was many peoples forced to act as one. Different languages, different cultures, different histories, different priorities. Trying to govern all of that from one powerful center, he warned, would not create unity. It would create domination. So he proposed something radical. Federalism. Not as a buzzword, not as a compromise, as a necessity. Each region should control its own development, its own education, its own economy, its own pace. The central government would coordinate, not dominate. This idea, it terrified the colonial administration because federalism meant less control, and it scared some Nigerian elites too because it meant no single group could own Nigeria. Awolowo wasn't playing ethnic politics. He was playing structural chess. Music sharpens. The book spread among students, among intellectuals, among young Nigerians who were tired of speeches with no substance. And suddenly, Awolowo wasn't just a writer, he was a movement. But ideas alone don't win power. Organization does. So in 1951, Awolowo helped form a political party that reflected his thinking, not just emotionally, but operationally. The Action Group. This wasn't a loose coalition. This wasn't "we'll figure it out later." It was disciplined, ideological, focused. The Action Group believed in federalism, free education, social welfare, rapid development through planning. No guessing, no ambiguity, and unlike many parties of the time, the Action Group actually trained its members. Political education, ideological clarity, accountability. This wasn't common. Most politicians were chasing power. Awolowo was building a system of governance. When Nigeria moved towards self-rule, regions were given more autonomy, and in 1954, Obafemi Awolowo became premier of the Western region. This is where theory met reality, and this is where legends are made or exposed. Music swells. Awolowo didn't wait. He moved fast. His most famous policy? Free primary education. Let that land. At a time when education was a privilege for the wealthy, Awolowo made it a right. Not partially free, not when funds allow, not pilot program, fully free. Critics said it was impossible. They said it was too expensive. They said it would fail. Awolowo ignored them. Schools multiplied. Enrollment exploded. A generation of children who would have been farmers, traders, laborers, became teachers, doctors, engineers, thinkers. This single policy changed the intellectual future of an entire region. And that wasn't all. Healthcare expanded, roads were built, public service became more efficient. And then came the move no one expected. Television. In 1959, the Western region launched Africa's first television station. Pause. Africa's first. Not Egypt, not South Africa, not colonial capitals. Western Nigeria. Why would a developing region invest in television?
Because Awolowo understood something most leaders still don't. Development is not just economic, it's informational. Control the narrative, educate the masses, unify people through shared knowledge. The Western region didn't just develop, it leaped. Brief silence. And when one region leaps ahead, others feel threatened. Other politicians began to feel exposed because suddenly excuses didn't work anymore. You couldn't say Africa can't do this when someone else was building schools and hospitals under the same system. Awolowo had done the most dangerous thing possible in politics. He proved it was possible. That made enemies. Politics turned ugly. Alliances broke. Accusations flew. Internal conflicts within the action group were amplified. And instead of settling disputes politically, they chose another route. Music darkens. 1962. Awolowo was accused of plotting to overthrow the federal government. The evidence was shaky. The timing was convenient. The intention was clear. Remove the threat. The trial was dramatic. The nation watched. And despite international concern and widespread skepticism, Obafemi Awolowo was convicted, sentenced to prison. For many politicians, prison is the end. For Awolowo, it was just another phase. Door slams, echo. Behind bars, Awolowo didn't break. He didn't beg. He didn't retreat. He wrote. He studied. He reflected. While Nigeria outside descended into instability, political chaos, military coups, rising tension, Awolowo sat quietly, still thinking about the future. And slowly, something ironic happened. The country started to fall apart. The leaders who removed Awolowo, they couldn't hold things together, and people began to whisper, maybe they locked up the wrong man. The irony was heavy. The man accused of threatening Nigeria's unity was the same man who warned that poor structure would destroy it, and he was being proven right in real time. Music rises, slow and ominous. This part of Awolowo's story teaches something uncomfortable. Progress invites resistance. Success attracts sabotage. When you expose what's possible, you threaten those surviving on excuses. Obafemi Awolowo didn't just challenge colonial power, he challenged mediocrity. And mediocrity always fights back. But prison wasn't the end of his influence. It was the calm before something even bigger. Because Nigeria was about to face its greatest crisis yet. And when everything began to collapse, they would come back to the man they tried to silence.
Prison is designed to do one thing really well. Erase you. Strip your name, shrink your influence, turn your voice into a memory. For most people, prison is where relevance goes to die. But Obafemi Awolowo was not most people. When the gates closed behind him in 1963, Nigeria thought the problem had been solved. The loud thinker was gone. The uncomfortable visionary was silenced. The man who made others look incompetent was finally out of the picture. But power made a fatal mistake. They locked up the body and forgot about the ideas. Obafemi Awolowo entered prison as a convicted politician. He entered history as something else entirely. Low, slow music fades in. Inside that cell, there were no rallies, no microphones, no supporters chanting his name, just concrete walls, a bed, paper, books, and time. Time to think without interruption. Time to observe Nigeria from a distance. Time to refine his beliefs. This is where most people would collapse, but Awolowo did the opposite. He sharpened. He read constantly. Economics, philosophy, governance, history. He wrote with discipline, not bitterness. He didn't use prison to complain. He used it to clarify. Because while he was behind bars, Nigeria outside was losing control. Sound design shifts, radio static, overlapping news voices. The First Republic was cracking. Regional tension escalated, political trust evaporated, elections became battlegrounds, and corruption began to rot institutions from the inside. Then came the military. 1966, the first coup. And just like that, Nigeria changed forever. Soldiers replaced politicians, uniforms replaced suits, orders replaced debate. Many Nigerians initially welcomed it. Civilian politics had disappointed them. The military promised discipline, order, and unity. But promises are easy. Reality, much harder. The coups triggered fear. Ethnic suspicion exploded. Violence followed. And before long, Nigeria was sliding toward its darkest chapter. Civil war. Music grows tense. The irony was painful. The man who warned that poor structure would destroy the country was in prison, while the country proved him right. Then something unexpected happened. The government began to struggle, financially. War is expensive, chaos is costly, and Nigeria's economy was at risk of collapse. They needed someone who understood numbers, someone who understood systems, someone who could stabilize a nation under pressure. They needed Obafemi Awolowo. Door creaks open. In 1967, Awolowo was released from prison and appointed Federal Commissioner for Finance and Vice Chairman of the Federal Executive Council during the Nigerian Civil War. Pause right there. Think about that. The same man they jailed as a threat to national unity was now being asked to save the nation. And he didn't gloat. He didn't hesitate. He didn't demand apologies. He accepted. Because for Awolowo, Nigeria was bigger than pride. Music steadies. The situation was brutal. The war had split the country. Resources were stretched thin. International confidence was low. Foreign pressure was intense. Many expected Nigeria to collapse under debt. But Awolowo had a different approach. No reckless borrowing, no dependency, no shortcuts. He believed war was not an excuse to destroy the future. So he made hard choices. He introduced policies that stabilized the currency. He controlled spending with discipline. He resisted international loans that would trap Nigeria in long-term dependency. This was not popular. Some wanted quick fixes. Some wanted foreign money. Some wanted to spend first and explain later. Awolowo said no. Again and again. Because he understood something most leaders fear to accept. Economic independence is as important as political independence. Under his economic leadership, Nigeria survived the war without collapsing into unmanageable debt. Read that again. Survived, without selling its future. Even his critics had to admit it. The man was effective. But effectiveness doesn't make you loved, it makes you respected. And sometimes feared. Music lowers. After the war ended in 1970, Nigeria was technically reunited but deeply wounded. Trust was broken, hope was fragile, and military rule continued. Awolowo returned to civilian political life, but the landscape had changed. Politics was no longer about ideas, it was about influence, control, survival. He tried anyway. He formed new political alliances, he campaigned, he spoke to the people again about education, federalism, social welfare. But this time, the system was different, and not in his favor. Elections were questionable, opposition was suppressed, power was centralized. Awolowo ran for president and lost. Again and again. Each loss hurt, not because of ambition,
but because Nigeria kept choosing short-term comfort over long-term structure. People admired him, but admiration doesn't always translate to votes. Why? Because Awolowo demanded discipline from leaders and citizens alike. He didn't promise miracles, he promised work. And work isn't always popular. Soft pause. Still, he didn't disappear. He kept writing, kept speaking, kept warning. He criticized military excesses, exposed corruption, advocated for education and social justice. And even without holding the highest office, his ideas kept spreading. Free education, now in national discussion. Federalism, now unavoidable. Social welfare, now expected. Awolowo was influencing Nigeria without ruling it. And that might be his most powerful chapter, because he proved something rare. You don't need the crown to shape the kingdom. Music rises slowly. This part of the story isn't flashy. No rallies, no dramatic victories, but it's essential. Because this is where Obafemi Awolowo transforms from politician to institution. A man whose thinking outlived his power. A leader whose absence exposed everyone else's weakness.
There's a moment in every great life when the question changes. Not, can I win? But, what am I willing to sacrifice? For Obafemi Awolowo, that moment came quietly. No prison cell this time, no war cabinet, no dramatic arrest. Just the slow realization that Nigeria was drifting and not toward the future he had imagined. The 1970s rolled in with oil money, military power, and big promises. Nigeria was suddenly rich on paper. Petrodollars flowed, confidence rose, skyscrapers climbed. But underneath the shine, the cracks were widening. Corruption became casual. Accountability became optional. Vision became seasonal. And Awolowo watched it all with growing concern. He had warned about this. Years earlier, he had argued that without strong institutions, wealth would only magnify weakness. That money without discipline doesn't build nations, it exposes them. Now, it was happening in real time. Music deepened slightly. When civilian rule returned in 1979, many Nigerians believed this was Awolowo's moment. Finally, after everything, after prison, after war, after sacrifice, this was his chance. He ran for president under the Unity Party of Nigeria, UPN. His campaign wasn't flashy. No empty slogans, no wild promises, no money-splashing theatrics. Instead, he talked about free education at all levels, universal health care, structured federalism, social welfare, ethical leadership. Basically, he ran on policy. And Nigerians listened, especially the educated, especially the youth, especially those who remembered the Western region days. But elections are not just about ideas. They are about machinery. And Awolowo was facing opponents who understood power differently. The election was controversial. Results were disputed. Mathematics was questioned. Trust was strained. In the end, Awolowo lost again. For some people, that would have been the breaking point. Decades of service, multiple attempts, endless sacrifice, all without the top seat. But Awolowo didn't collapse. He didn't sell out. He didn't compromise his values. He didn't rewrite himself to fit the moment. Instead, he did something rare. He stayed consistent.
Consistency doesn't trend. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't excite crowds in the short term. But history loves it. Awolowo returned to opposition politics, not bitter, but firm. He criticized corruption openly. He challenged military and civilian excesses. He spoke truth even when it isolated him. And isolation came. Some former allies distanced themselves. Some younger politicians said he was outdated. Others said he was too rigid for modern politics. Too principled, they said, as if principle was a weakness. But Awolowo understood something they didn't. When leaders abandon principles to gain power, power becomes the only principle left. And that never ends well. Music subtly intensifies. As Nigeria moved through the 1980s, military rule returned again. Hope dipped. Inflation rose. Daily life became harder for ordinary people. Awolowo was aging now. His voice wasn't as loud, his steps not as fast, but his mind still sharp. He continued writing books, essays, speeches. He documented Nigeria's political failures not to shame, but to teach. Because Awolowo had accepted something painful. He might not live to see the Nigeria he imagined. But maybe, just maybe, others would. So he focused on legacy. Not statues, not titles, but ideas that survive. He mentored younger minds, engaged students, encouraged debate. He believed education was still Nigeria's greatest weapon against poverty, against corruption, against bad leadership. And even as the country struggled, his ideas refused to die. States continued free education programs inspired by his policies. Politicians quoted him even when they didn't follow him. Intellectuals studied his writings. Activists referenced his vision. Awolowo had become unavoidable, even in loss. Music softens. But there's a quiet sadness in this part of the story. Because Awolowo never stopped believing in Nigeria, yet Nigeria kept disappointing him. He watched leaders misuse power, watched institutions weaken, watched public trust erode. And still, he didn't walk away. That's the part that hurts the most. Because it would have been easier to give up, to say, I tried, to retreat into comfort, to protect peace of mind. But Awolowo stayed engaged. He believed citizenship didn't expire with age, and that belief alone makes him rare. Subtle breath. By the mid-1980s, his health began to decline. The years had taken their toll. Still, when he spoke, people listened, because there are some voices that carry weight, not because they are loud, but because they are honest. On May 9th, 1987, Obafemi Awolowo passed away. No office, no presidency, no final victory speech. Just silence. And then, an awakening. Nigeria paused. People mourned not just a man, but a missed possibility. Newspapers revisited his ideas. Citizens debated his legacy. Young Nigerians asked questions they hadn't asked before. What if we had listened? What if we had chosen discipline over drama? What if integrity had won? Awolowo's death forced a national reflection. And reflections are dangerous. Because once you see what could have been, you can't unsee it. Music rises gently. This chapter of his life isn't about triumph. It's about steadfastness. About choosing values even when they cost you everything. About standing alone and staying upright. Awolowo never bent, not to popularity,
not to power, not to pressure. And while that cost him the presidency, it earned him something else. Respect across generations, credibility beyond politics, a name that refuses to fade. But legacy isn't finished when a life ends. That's when it really begins. Because the final question still remains. What does Obafemi Awolowo mean now?
Some people leave this world loudly. Grand funerals, statues, long motorcades, names etched into buildings. Others leave quietly. No throne, no final victory, no last speech to seal the moment. But then there are a few, very few, who leave something heavier than presents. They leave questions. Obafemi Awolowo was one of those people. When he died in 1987, Nigeria didn't just lose a former premier or a failed presidential candidate. Nigeria lost a mirror. Because Awolowo's life forces an uncomfortable comparison between what was possible and what was chosen instead. Let's be honest, Awolowo never became president. He never ruled Nigeria at the center. He never held the ultimate power so many chase. Yet, decades later, his name still comes up. In classrooms, in debates, in political arguments, in moments of frustration. Why? Because power fades, but principle lingers. Awolowo wasn't remembered because he won everything. He's remembered because he stood for something. And in a country where politics often bends with the wind, that alone is revolutionary. Look around Nigeria today. Every argument about restructuring, Awolowo warned us. Every demand for free or affordable education, Awolowo implemented it successfully. Every conversation about federalism, regional development, and strong institutions, you are walking through his ideas. Even people who never read his books are living inside his thinking. That's legacy. Not vibes, not branding. Impact. Awolowo believed that education was the great equalizer, that once you educate a child, you don't just change one life, you reset an entire bloodline. And history proved him right. The Western region produced generations of professionals, doctors, lawyers, academics, civil servants, many of whom became national leaders themselves. That didn't happen by accident. It happened by policy. Awolowo didn't wait for wealth to educate people. He educated people to create wealth. That mindset alone separates leaders from managers. But here's the part that really hits. Awolowo's ideas were not radical. They were reasonable. Free education, healthcare access, accountable governance, strong institutions, decentralized power. These are not extreme demands. They are basics. Yet, they were treated like threats. Why? Because systems built on mediocrity are afraid of competence. Because corruption hates structure. Because discipline exposes laziness. Because vision embarrasses excuses. Awolowo wasn't dangerous because he wanted power. He was dangerous because he showed what good leadership actually looked like. And once people see that, they can't unsee it. There's a painful lesson in his life. Nigeria didn't reject Awolowo because he was wrong. Nigeria rejected him because he was ahead. Ahead of the politics, ahead of the culture, ahead of the patience required for real nation building. He asked for long-term thinking in a space addicted to short-term wins, and that rarely ends in popularity, but it does end in respect. Ask yourself this. How many leaders today would rather lose an election than betray their principles? How many would refuse bribes knowing it might cost them power? How many would choose consistency over convenience? Awolowo did, again and again and again. That's why his life feels heavier with time, because as years pass, his warnings keep aging well. Corruption, he warned us. Weak institutions, he warned us. Over-centralization of power, he warned us. Education neglect, he warned us. And yet,
We still debate whether his ideas were realistic. But the truth is, they were realistic enough to work when he implemented them. That's the part nobody can erase. The Western region wasn't a theory, it was proof. Awolowo showed that Africa didn't need saving, it needed organization. He showed that poverty wasn't destiny, it was policy failure. He showed that leadership wasn't magic, it was responsibility. And maybe that's why his story still unsettles people, because it removes excuses. But Awolowo's legacy isn't just for politicians, it's for citizens too. He believed that democracy only works when people are educated enough to demand better, that blind loyalty is dangerous, that silence enables bad leadership. He wanted Nigerians to think, to question, to read, to hold leaders accountable, not worship them. That's a scary idea for power, but it's a necessary one for progress. Today, young Nigerians are frustrated with leadership, with opportunity, with systems that feel stacked against them. And in that frustration, Awolowo's story hits differently. Because he didn't wait for perfect conditions, he built anyway. He didn't inherit power, he studied for it. He didn't compromise to win, he stood firm and lost with dignity. And that teaches a different kind of success. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. So maybe the real question isn't, why didn't Awolowo become president? Maybe the real question is, what kind of Nigeria would exist today if more leaders thought like him? And deeper still, what kind of citizen are you choosing to be? Because legacies don't survive on admiration alone. They survive when people continue the work. Awolowo's story doesn't end with his death. It waits, in classrooms, in conversations, in choices, in the courage to demand better. He proved that one disciplined mind could challenge an empire, that one principled life could outlive power, that losing with integrity could matter more than winning without it. Obafemi Awolowo didn't rule Nigeria, but he defined what Nigeria could be. And that is a legacy no prison, no election, no era could ever erase.
Imagine a dusty town in northern Nigeria in the early 1900s. No skyscrapers, no microphones, no crowds chanting names, just the sun hanging heavy in the sky and a quiet boy who had no idea he was about to walk straight into history. This isn't the story of someone born into power. This is the story of someone who grew into it, slowly, steadily, and against the odds. His name was Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, and before he ever became a symbol, he was just a kid trying to learn, survive, and find his voice. Balewa was born in December 1912 in Bauchi, during a time when Nigeria didn't even exist as the country we know today. The land was under British colonial rule, and life was sharply divided. Power sat far away, usually in the hands of people who didn't look like you, didn't speak your language, and didn't care about your dreams. His family wasn't rich. His father worked as a district head's assistant, which meant they were respected, but definitely not elite. No silver spoon, no shortcuts, just expectations, discipline, and a whole lot of pressure to not mess up. From early on, Balewa stood out, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he listened. He observed. While other kids ran around without a care, he paid attention to words, to ideas, to how authority worked. He started his education in a Quranic school, learning Arabic and Islamic studies, grounding him deeply in faith, discipline, and moral responsibility. That foundation mattered more than anyone realized at the time because it shaped how he would see leadership later, not as domination, but as duty. Then came the turning point, Western education. At a time when many families were skeptical or even fearful of Western-style schools, Balewa was sent to Bauchi Provincial School. This wasn't normal. For many northern families, Western education felt like a trap, something that could pull children away from culture and religion. But Balewa leaned into it, hard.
He didn't just attend school, he excelled. Teachers noticed, administrators noticed. This quiet kid had something different: clarity, patience, and an unusual ability to explain complex ideas simply. That ability would become his secret weapon. By the time he reached Katsina College, one of the most prestigious institutions in northern Nigeria, Balewa was already sharpening the skills that would later define him. Katsina College wasn't just a school, it was a training ground for future leaders. The British used it to groom intermediaries, Africans who could help run the colonial system. But what the British didn't fully realize was that they were also creating thinkers, questioners, future nationalists. Balewa absorbed everything: history, literature, governance, and most importantly, he learned how systems worked, how decisions were made, who had power and who didn't. He wasn't loud about his opinions, but he was forming them, carefully, strategically. After graduating, Balewa became a teacher, and this part of his life, super underrated. Teaching wasn't just a job for him, it was a mission. He taught English and other subjects, and his students loved him. Why? Because he didn't talk at people, he talked with them. He believed knowledge was something to share, not hoard. In classrooms across northern Nigeria, Balewa wasn't just teaching grammar, he was shaping minds, encouraging confidence, and quietly planting the seeds of self-worth in a generation that had been told they were inferior. But here's where the story starts heating up. While Balewa was teaching, Nigeria was changing, slowly but undeniably. The world was shifting after World War II. Colonized nations everywhere were starting to ask dangerous questions. Why aren't we ruling ourselves? Why do outsiders decide our future? Why do we obey? In southern Nigeria, nationalist movements were already loud and bold: protests, newspapers, political parties. But in the north, things were different. Change moved cautiously. Traditions were strong, and many feared that moving too fast would tear society apart. Balewa found himself standing at a crossroads. He could stay in education forever, safe, respected, influential in quiet ways, or he could step into politics, a world full of conflict, suspicion, and impossible expectations. For someone as calm and reserved as Balewa, politics was risky. But history doesn't wait for comfort. In 1946, he was nominated to represent Bauchi Province in the Northern House of Assembly. That moment changed everything. Suddenly, the teacher was in the room where decisions were made, and people listened when he spoke, not because he shouted, not because he threatened, but because he made sense. He had this rare talent of explaining complicated political realities in language everyone could understand. Farmers, traditional rulers, British officials, fellow Nigerians, everyone felt like he was talking to them, not down to them. As he stepped deeper into politics, Balewa became one of the founding members of the Northern People's Congress. This party would go on to dominate northern Nigerian politics, but at the time, it was still finding its identity. The North needed leaders who could protect its interests while also engaging with the rest of Nigeria. And Balewa, he was perfect for that role. He wasn't radical, he wasn't reckless. He believed in gradual change, dialogue, and balance. Some people thought he was too soft. Others thought he was exactly what Nigeria needed, a bridge between cultures, regions, and ideologies. By the early 1950s, Balewa had risen fast, from teacher to lawmaker to minister. In 1952, he became Nigeria's Minister of Works. Let that sink in. A man born under colonial rule was now helping run the system itself. But instead of getting comfortable, Balewa pushed for more Nigerian involvement in governance. He wanted Nigerians, not foreigners, making decisions about Nigerian lives. Still, Nigeria wasn't united. Ethnic tensions simmered. North versus South, Muslims versus Christians, traditionalists versus modernists. Everyone wanted power, but nobody fully trusted anyone else. And right in the middle of all this chaos stood Balewa, calm as ever, trying to keep the peace. What made him stand out wasn't ambition, it was restraint.
While others chased headlines, he focused on stability. While others attacked rivals, he chose words carefully. He believed Nigeria could only survive if its leaders learned to compromise. But compromise has a price. As independence drew closer, pressure intensified. Political alliances were shaky. Every move was scrutinized. One wrong decision could break the country before it even began. And slowly, almost quietly, Balewa found himself being pushed forward, not because he demanded it, but because others trusted him to carry the weight. By the late 1950s, it was clear Nigeria was about to be born. And when that moment came, the question wasn't if Balewa would play a role, it was how big that role would be. And that's where we pause, because next, the teacher becomes the face of a nation. The calm voice steps on the world stage, and the pressure, it multiplies. This is only the beginning.
By the late 1950s, Nigeria was standing on a knife's edge. Independence was no longer a dream people whispered about. It was a date on the calendar getting closer every single day. The British could feel it. Nigerian politicians could feel it. Ordinary people felt it in markets, in schools, in mosques and churches. Something big was coming. And Abubakar, Tafawa Balewa, he was right in the middle of the storm, whether he liked it or not. By now, Balewa wasn't just another politician. He had become a key figure in the Northern People's Congress, and his reputation had spread far beyond the North. People described him as calm, measured, almost painfully polite. But don't get it twisted, that calm wasn't weakness, it was control. While other leaders spoke in fire and fury, Balewa spoke in logic and long-term thinking, and that made him dangerous in a different way. In 1957, Balewa became Chief Minister of the Federation of Nigeria. Read that again. Not just a regional leader, not just a northern representative. This was a federal role, meaning he was now responsible for holding together a country that barely trusted itself. Nigeria at this time was like three different worlds forced into one body: the North, the West, and the East, each with its own cultures, political parties, and fears. The North worried about being rushed into change and losing its traditions. The West pushed hard for rapid modernization and self-rule. The East demanded fairness, representation, and economic opportunity. Everyone was suspicious. Everyone felt like someone else was trying to dominate. And Balewa, he was expected to be the referee. The British, watching from the sidelines, quietly approved of him. He was steady, predictable, not radical, not revolutionary in a way that scared them. But here's the part people miss. Balewa wasn't a British puppet. He believed in independence deeply. He just believed it had to be managed, not rushed like a reckless sprint. As independence talks intensified, Balewa represented Nigeria at constitutional conferences in London. Picture him there, soft-spoken, dressed simply, standing in rooms full of imperial officials who had ruled Nigeria for decades. Some probably underestimated him. Big mistake. Balewa didn't argue emotionally. He argued strategically. He laid out Nigeria's case with clarity, insisting on self-governance while acknowledging the country's internal complexities. He wasn't pretending Nigeria was perfectly united. He was honest about the challenges, and that honesty earned him respect. Behind closed doors back home, though, things were tense. Political rivals questioned whether Balewa was too cautious. Some Southerners felt the North, and by extension, Balewa, was slowing down progress. Some Northerners worried he was giving too much away. He was being pulled from all sides, and no matter what he did, someone was unhappy. But history doesn't reward people for being liked. It rewards people for holding the line. Then came 1959, the year everything locked into place. Nigeria held federal elections to determine who would lead the country into independence. This wasn't just another vote. This was the vote. Power blocks formed. Alliances were negotiated late into the night. The Northern People's Congress didn't win an outright majority, but they emerged as the strongest party. To govern, they needed allies.
So a coalition was formed between the NPC and the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, the NCNC, two very different men, two very different regions, one fragile agreement. And at the center of it all stood Balewa. In 1959, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa became Nigeria's first prime minister designate. Let that land for a second. A teacher from Bauchi, a quiet kid from a modest background, now the man tasked with leading Africa's most populous country into independence. On October 1st, 1960, Nigeria officially became an independent nation. That day was electric. Crowds gathered, flags rose, the British Union Jack came down, and the green-white-green flag went up. Speeches echoed, music filled the air. For the first time, Nigeria belonged to Nigerians. And Abubakar Tafawa Balewa stood before the world as Prime Minister. His independence speech wasn't dramatic, no chest thumping, no victory laps. Instead, he spoke about unity, responsibility, and the long road ahead. He warned that independence was not the end of struggle, it was the beginning of accountability. That tone, it defined his leadership. But the celebrations didn't last long. Running a newly independent country is like being handed a car while it's already speeding down the highway and the engine is overheating. Balewa immediately faced massive challenges: economic inequality, ethnic rivalries, weak institutions, and a political culture still learning how democracy worked. One of his biggest challenges was balancing regional power. Nigeria's federal system gave regions significant autonomy, but that also meant regional leaders often prioritized local interests over national unity. Every decision Balewa made was judged through an ethnic lens. Appointments, development projects, budget allocations, nothing was neutral. And then there was the military. At independence, Nigeria inherited a military structure created by the British, one not fully integrated, not deeply loyal to civilian rule, and quietly divided along regional lines. Balewa believed firmly in civilian supremacy. He trusted institutions. He trusted dialogue. What he didn't fully grasp, at least not yet, was how fragile that trust was. But internationally, though, Balewa shone. On the world stage, he was respected. He represented Nigeria at the United Nations, advocating for African unity and decolonization across the continent. He spoke against apartheid in South Africa. He supported independence movements in other African countries. Nigeria, under Balewa, positioned itself as a moral voice in global affairs. Foreign leaders listened to him. They saw Nigeria as a stabilizing force in Africa and Balewa as a statesman, not just a local politician. But back home, though, the cracks were widening. Elections in the western region turned violent. Political rivalries exploded into chaos. Accusations of rigging, intimidation, and corruption flew everywhere. The press went wild. Trust in democracy began to erode. People started asking hard questions. Was democracy really working? Was the federal government strong enough? Was Balewa too calm for a country on fire? Critics said he was slow, that he avoided confrontation, that he relied too heavily on compromise. Supporters argued he was the only thing keeping Nigeria from tearing itself apart. And honestly, both were kind of true. Balewa was trying to govern a country that hadn't agreed on what it wanted to be. He was trying to hold together a fragile alliance of regions that barely trusted one another, and he was doing it without authoritarian force, by choice. By the early 1960s, the pressure was relentless. Political assassinations, regional unrest, and economic frustration were becoming normal headlines. The optimism of independence was fading, replaced by anxiety and anger. Still, Balewa kept going. He believed Nigeria could survive if its leaders stayed committed to dialogue, law, and gradual reform. He believed the chaos was temporary, that stability would come with time. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see yet, was that darker forces were already moving in the background, that patience was running out in places he didn't control, that the very calm that defined him would soon be tested in ways no one expected. Because next, the politics turned deadly, the balance breaks, and Nigeria's future hangs by a thread. By the early 1960s, Nigeria looked independent on paper, but emotionally, spiritually, politically, it was still figuring itself out.
The flag was Nigerian, the anthem was Nigerian, the prime minister was Nigerian, but the systems underneath were fragile, stressed, and pulling in different directions like a rope about to snap. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa felt it every day. Every morning he woke up carrying the weight of a country that was arguing with itself. Not just politicians, everyone. Newspapers were loud, political rallies were angry, regional leaders were defensive, trust was evaporating. And the scariest part, people were slowly losing faith in the idea that talking things out actually worked. Balewa still believed in dialogue. He still believed that Nigeria's diversity wasn't a weakness but a strength if it was handled carefully. But patience is a hard sell when people are hurting, hungry, or convinced they are being cheated. And by now, many Nigerians were convinced of exactly that. The Western region became ground zero for political chaos. Elections there were intense, personal, and bitter. Accusations of rigging flew everywhere. Supporters clashed, streets filled with fear. What started as political competition spiraled into unrest that shocked the nation. People wanted answers. Why wasn't the federal government stepping in harder? Why wasn't Balewa cracking down? Why did it feel like politicians could do whatever they wanted without consequences? To Balewa, the answer was simple but unpopular. Using force would break democracy faster than it would fix it. He believed that once civilian leaders started ruling through fear, Nigeria would lose the very freedom it had just gained. But here's the thing about leadership. Sometimes your principles don't protect you from blame. As the Western region crisis deepened, critics began to frame Balewa as distant, detached, and overly cautious. They said he talked too much and acted too little. They said he was letting the country slide into disorder. Some even claimed he was protecting political allies instead of protecting the nation. Behind closed doors, Balewa was exhausted. He wasn't blind. He knew corruption existed. He knew some politicians abused power, but removing them wasn't as simple as people thought. Nigeria's political structure was a delicate web of alliances. Pull one thread too hard and the entire thing could collapse. And meanwhile, something else was happening quietly, dangerously in the background. The military was watching. Young officers, educated, ambitious, frustrated, were growing impatient. They saw politicians arguing endlessly while ordinary people suffered. They saw corruption cases delayed. They saw violence go unpunished. And slowly, an idea began to form in some minds. Maybe civilians couldn't fix this. Balewa underestimated how fast that idea was spreading. To him, the military was meant to protect the nation, not run it. He believed firmly in civilian control. He believed the constitution would hold. After all, Nigeria wasn't unique. Other countries had gone through rocky starts too. He thought this was just part of the process. But history doesn't always wait for optimism. By 1964, the political atmosphere was toxic. Federal elections were approaching, and instead of excitement, there was dread. Political parties were deeply polarized. Trust in the electoral process was shaky at best. Many Nigerians believed the system was already broken. When the elections came, they were chaotic. Boycotts, disputes, confusion. Legitimacy was questioned almost immediately. Some regions refused to accept results. Tension skyrocketed. For the first time, Balewa faced something terrifying, not opposition, not criticism, but the possibility that Nigeria's democracy might simply stop working. Still, he kept holding the line. He pushed for constitutional solutions, negotiations, emergency measures within the law. He refused to abandon democratic processes, even when they were messy. To him, democracy was supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be resilient. But resilience has limits.
By 1965, violence in parts of the country became harder to ignore. Political rivalry wasn't just about speeches anymore. It was spilling into everyday life, markets, streets, homes. Fear became normal. And the public mood shifted from frustration to anger. People started saying things like, at least soldiers would bring order. At least they'd stop the fighting. At least they'd be decisive. Those words, they are dangerous, because once people stop believing in civilian leadership, the door opens to something much harder to close. Balewa sensed the danger, but he didn't know how close it was. Despite everything, he kept representing Nigeria internationally with dignity. Abroad, Nigeria still looked strong, still looked stable, still looked like a leader of African diplomacy. But that contrast between Nigeria's image outside and its reality inside was becoming painful. At home, whispers turned into rumors, rumors turned into fear. Balewa received warnings, some subtle, some direct. Friends urged him to be careful, to tighten security, to act faster, to trust less. But Balewa wasn't a paranoid man. He didn't rule through fear. He didn't believe his own people would turn against the democratic system so violently. That belief, as noble as it was, left him exposed. In January 1966, Nigeria was tense but quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wrong, the kind that sits heavy in the air. Politicians were preparing for another day of arguments, another round of negotiations, another attempt to stabilize the country. No one announced what was coming. No warning sirens, no dramatic countdown. Just a nation holding its breath without knowing why. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa went to sleep, believing, as he always had, that Nigeria could still be saved through patience, law, and unity. He did not know that this would be one of his last nights as Prime Minister, because the next chapter doesn't begin with debate or dialogue. It begins with betrayal, with shock, and with a moment that would change Nigeria forever.
January 15th, 1966. A date that would echo through Nigerian history. The country had been tense for months, simmering under the surface with political disputes, ethnic grievances, and frustration over corruption. But no one expected the storm that was about to hit. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, Nigeria's first Prime Minister, woke up that morning and went about his usual routines. Meetings with advisors, reports from ministries, the endless correspondence of a leader trying to hold a massive, fragile federation together. He didn't know that outside the gates of power, a group of young army officers had already begun to move. They weren't acting in secret for months. They were acting with purpose, with precision, with the belief that the country had gone too far off track to save itself through normal politics. The officers were frustrated. They had watched democracy fail to resolve Nigeria's internal crises. They had watched political leaders argue while violence spread. They had watched ordinary citizens lose faith in elections and institutions, and they had decided, whether rightly or wrongly, that only a decisive, forceful action could restore order. At first, Balewa didn't realize what was happening. Reports trickled in slowly, units of the army moving without authorization, leaders being detained, confusion spreading across major cities. Then the full picture hit. It wasn't just unrest, it was a military coup. The country he had helped to build, the democracy he had fought to protect, was under attack. Balewa's first instinct was to negotiate, as he had always done. He tried to reach out to military officers he knew to remind them of loyalty, duty, and the dangers of taking power by force. He reminded them that Nigeria's fragile unity depended on dialogue, compromise, and respect for law. But this time, words were powerless. The officers had already made their decision.
They weren't listening, they were executing. In the chaos, Balewa's government was dismantled. Ministers were arrested. Parliament was paralyzed. The machinery of the new nation painstakingly dealt over decades of education, planning, and negotiation began to grind to a halt. Balewa himself was targeted. He was a symbol, the figurehead of civilian rule. His calm, measured leadership, which had inspired respect both at home and abroad, was now seen as a threat to those who wanted absolute control. The man who had always believed in unity and stability was a liability in the eyes of young, impatient officers who believed they were saving the country. He was removed from power, quietly at first, but the gravity of his situation was impossible to ignore. Nigeria, the nation he had helped to bring into existence, was teetering on the edge. Political alliances he had spent years forging evaporated overnight. Friends and allies were detained or fled. The country's image abroad, the dignified, emerging African nation, was shattered in hours. Balewa's personal courage was remarkable. Even in the face of betrayal, he maintained composure. There are accounts that describe him remaining calm, speaking thoughtfully, and refusing to react in anger, even when the full weight of the coup pressed down on him. This wasn't cowardice. It was the same patience and rationality that had defined his political life. But courage alone could not save him. The coup had opened a door that could not be closed. Nigeria, the nation he had helped to bring into existence, was now under the control of forces he could neither negotiate with nor reason with. In the aftermath, the nation entered a period of uncertainty and fear. Cities were tense. Civilians were confused, terrified, and angry. Rumors ran rampant. Would the military consolidate power or restore civilian rule? Would violence escalate? Would regions rise against each other in retaliation? The international community watched with shock. Nations that had admired Balewa's diplomacy now faced a Nigeria that seemed fractured, leaderless, and unpredictable. The quiet statesman who had represented African dignity on the world stage was now a captive of circumstances he never imagined. But the story doesn't end with despair. Balewa's legacy had been built over decades. His influence, his teachings, his example, and his belief in dialogue and compromise didn't vanish because of a single day. People remembered his calm, reasoned approach. Even in crisis, his leadership had been defined not by force, but by principle. Yet, the coup marked the beginning of a dangerous period. Nigeria was no longer the same country. The ideals Balewa had championed, unity, patience, lawful governance, were under siege. The fragile democracy he had helped construct was now on life support. This was the moment where his life and the nation's future would intersect with tragedy. Balewa's fate was intertwined with Nigeria itself, and what came next would cement his place in history, not as a perfect leader, but as a symbol of what the country could have been and a reminder of the cost of fragile unity. Because in Part 5, we confront the consequences, the dramatic, shocking, and unforgettable climax of Balewa's story. It's where history tests him one final time and where his legacy is forever sealed in the memory of Nigeria and the world.
The morning after the coup, Nigeria was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. Streets were empty, offices were shuttered, radio stations were muted or broadcasting vague statements. People whispered in hushed tones, unsure who to trust or who was in charge. Balewa, once the calm architect of Nigeria's future, was now caught in the eye of a storm he had spent his entire career trying to prevent. The young officers who orchestrated the coup had plans, and Balewa was at the center of them. Reports from that day paint a chilling picture. Men who had once sworn to defend the country were now questioning the very leadership they were tasked to protect. They claimed they acted for the good of Nigeria, but the line between duty and ambition blurred in deadly ways. Balewa's removal from power was swift. There was no trial, no debate, no chance to defend the democracy he had built. He was isolated. Meetings he once chaired were now decisions he had no part in. Yet, even under these conditions, his composure never faltered. Accounts from those around him describe a man who spoke softly, clearly, and without panic, still trying to reason, still trying to mediate, even though the walls were closing in. But calmness could not shield him. As the hours passed, the consequences of the coup became unavoidable. The country was fractured. Military units moved without orders. Violence erupted sporadically. Politicians fled or were detained. The fragile trust Balewa had painstakingly cultivated across regions collapsed overnight. In that chaos, he remained a symbol, the last embodiment of the democratic Nigeria many had dreamed of, now a target because of what he represented. Balewa understood the stakes. He knew that if the military solidified power and civilian leaders were eliminated or silenced, Nigeria would enter an era of fear and authoritarian rule. But he also understood, painfully, that he was powerless to stop it. His principles, patience, and dedication to dialogue were virtues in ordinary politics, but in a sudden violent seizure of power, they became liabilities. The coup was more than a political shift. It was personal. Balewa, a man who had spent decades building bridges between regions, had become a victim of those very divisions. The ethnic and regional tensions he had tried so hard to manage were exploited. The unity he believed could hold a nation together was weaponized against him. And then came the final, irreversible blow. Balewa was arrested and taken away. Accounts of the exact circumstances vary, but what is consistent is the tragic reality. The first Prime Minister of independent Nigeria, the calm voice of reason, the man who had stood for dialogue, law, and patience, was no longer in control of his fate. Within days, the coup's consequences rippled across Nigeria. The democratic structures Balewa had nurtured were dismantled. Regions were left to fend for themselves. Civilians watched in fear as soldiers patrolled streets and new leaders emerged not through debate or consensus, but through force. The hopes and optimism of independence, the pride of finally being a self-governing nation were replaced with uncertainty, tension, and dread. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa's story didn't end in quiet obscurity. Even in the midst of tragedy, he became a symbol of what Nigeria could have been, a country united through reason, dialogue, and careful, patient leadership. His life, career, and ultimate fate became a cautionary tale of how fragile democracy can be when principles clash with raw power, and how even the most disciplined, thoughtful leaders can be swept aside by forces beyond their control. Internationally, his absence was felt immediately. Leaders who once admired Nigeria's calm and moral voice now saw a nation teetering. The ideals Balewa had represented, civility, patience, compromise, were replaced with uncertainty and fear. And while history often celebrates revolution and dramatic change, Balewa's legacy endured in a quieter yet equally powerful way, as a reminder that leadership is not just about taking power, it's about serving it wisely, responsibly, and with humility. Decades later, people still remember him. Schools, streets, and institutions carry his name. Historians study his speeches. Citizens debate what he could have done differently and what Nigeria might have become if his principles had held sway. But beyond the analysis, there's something deeper. a feeling that Balewa represented a possibility, a Nigeria that could be led with patience, integrity, and moral clarity, even in the face of chaos. His story is a lesson, loud and persistent. History favors no one, but the values a leader upholds can echo long after they are gone. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa didn't just live through a pivotal era, he defined the ideals of it, stood firm in the storms, and left a legacy that continues to challenge and inspire, reminding every new generation that leadership is not just about survival, it's about vision, courage, and unwavering commitment to what is right, even when the world seems determined to prove otherwise. And so, his life ends in tragedy, but his story becomes immortal. It's a tale of quiet strength, the weight of responsibility, and the delicate, dangerous beauty of building a nation from scratch, a story that makes you think, feel, and ask, what kind of leadership does the world really need? Abubakar Tafawa Balewa may have been taken from power, but his principles, his voice, and his vision continue to whisper across history, an unshakable reminder of the cost of courage and the fragility of democracy.